The lamp on my desk flickered as the fog rolled in thick, heavy, almost alive. Victorian London had a smell you never forgot. Coal, damp stone, and something else. Something sweeter, something dangerous. That night, I found it. A small brown bottle, the kind mothers kept beside the cradle and doctors prescribed with pride. Its label was delicate, almost beautiful, promising soothing relief in elegant script. But the moment I lifted it to the light, something felt wrong. Too light, too innocent, too confident. No medicine should look this inviting. And as I pulled the cork free, the truth hit me like cold air from an open grave. This wasn't a remedy. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't relief. It was pure heroin sold as casually as cough syrup, swallowed by an entire city that never realized what was destroying them. And the most unsettling part? This bottle wasn't rare. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't forbidden. It was everywhere. If you think you know Victorian London, you don't. Not yet. What you're about to see is the truth. Victorian London never meant to leave behind a truth that's darker, stranger, and far more addictive than the bottle itself. If you enjoy wandering into these quiet corners of forgotten history with me, the strange cures, the hidden dangers, the stories whispered behind closed doors, then stay close. Subscribe and stay with me. Victorian London is full of dim corners, forgotten tonics, and medicines that were anything but merciful. There are more secrets steeped in fog, more bottles with darker stories waiting to be opened. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The past is never as distant as it seems, because before heroin became a word of ruin, it wore a doctor's approval and a mother's trust. In Victorian London, it lived on nursery shelves and apothecary counters, offered as comfort in a world already bruised by disease and smoke. And tonight, we're going back into that world softly, carefully, to see how a city swallowed a poison it believed was a blessing. The mornings in Victorian London always seemed to begin in half-light, a kind of grey stillness that settled over the rooftops before the city fully stirred. On the narrow street outside the chemist's shop, the fog curled low across the cobblestones, softening the sound of passing hooves, dimming the glow of the gas lamps, and pressing itself against every window pane like a silent visitor trying to peer inside. It was in that muted hour, before the apprentices arrived and before the shop bell began its day-long chiming, that the little brown bottles waited on the polished shelves, catching what little light the morning offered. They were ordinary things at first glance, small glass phials no larger than a man's hand, their dark amber color chosen not for beauty but for purpose. The tint shielded the contents from sunlight, or so the chemist said, preserving the strength of the remedy within. If anyone paused long enough to look, they might notice how the bottles gleamed like warm honey when the first rays of dawn slipped through the front window. On some mornings, the sight was almost comforting, as if the shelves themselves exhaled a soft golden glow in an otherwise weary shop. But the little brown bottle on the counter that day was different. Its label had begun to curl at the corners, the ink slightly smudged from the touch of countless fingers. For coughs, pain, and restless sleep, it read in graceful handwriting, a promise written in the kind of script people trusted without question. Beneath the title, in smaller letters, was the name of the chemist who mixed it, and beneath that, the instructions: 1 teaspoon, as needed. There was nothing about danger, nothing about dependence, nothing about the world it would quietly remake. The chemist, Mr. Holling, arrived just as he always did, pushing open the door with a soft grunt, shaking the morning chill from his coat, lighting the lamps one by one until the shop glowed with steady amber warmth. He set his hat on the hook, straightened the jars of ointments behind the counter, and ran a cloth over the display case as if polishing away whatever shadows the night had left behind. When he saw the little brown bottle waiting for him, he picked it up with a nod of satisfaction. It was one of his best sellers. Outside, the city was waking slowly, heavily. A woman with a child wrapped in wool passed by the shop, her footsteps dragging as if she carried more weight than the small figure in her arms. Men in soot-streaked coats coughed into handkerchiefs already stained grey from factory dust. A carriage driver rubbed his temples, squinting through the early fog as though the world refused to come into focus. Illness was everywhere. In the air, in the water, in the lungs of nearly everyone who walked the London streets. People needed relief, and London's chemists, with their jars and vials and tinctures, were eager to provide it. Mr. Holling opened the little brown bottle, breathing in the faint, sweet scent that rose from its mouth, a mixture of alcohol, syrup, and something sharper beneath. He didn't flinch. To him, it smelled like progress, modernity, a miracle extracted from the laboratories of Europe and refined into something he could sell for a few shillings. He poured a fresh measure into the bottle, wiped the lip clean, and sealed it with a practiced twist. Then he set it back in its place, unaware of the small tremor it sparked each time it changed hands. Soon enough, the apprentices arrived, and the day began in earnest. The bell chimed. Customers filed in. The bottle left the shelf before noon, pressed into the palm of a tired mother whose eyes held a blend of gratitude and exhaustion. She bundled it into her apron pocket, with the same care she might give a loaf of bread or a child's blanket, unaware of the quiet storm sealed beneath the cork. Outside, the fog thinned, the city grew louder, and somewhere in that rising noise above the clatter of hooves, the clash of carts, the coughing crowds, the little brown bottle began its quiet work. It would soothe. Yes, it would calm. It would offer relief where nothing else did. But it would also awaken something London wasn't yet prepared to face. The city believed it had purchased comfort. Instead, it had welcomed a new kind of hunger. The label was the first thing anyone noticed, a small rectangle of cream-colored paper, pressed smooth against the curve of the bottle, and held in place by a thin coat of glue that smelled faintly of gum arabic. In a city crowded with noise, filth, and desperation, such neatness felt like a small mercy. The letters were written in elegant, looping script, each stroke steady, confident, assured. It was the kind of handwriting that suggested education, refinement, and above all, trustworthiness. And trust was a currency in Victorian London more precious than coin. In those days, people believed the written word more than their own instincts. A label could make poison look like salvation. A sentence could reshape the fate of an entire household. And so when Londoners saw the words guaranteed safe, gentle, reliable, beneath the decorative border, they exhaled with quiet relief, as though the paper itself had laid a calming hand on their shoulders. No one paused to question how such certainty had been inked into existence. No one wondered why a medicine needed such reassurance in the first place. The label's promise was designed to be irresistible. For coughs, for sleeplessness, for nerves. The Victorian age had no shortage of ailments that fell under those broad, hazy categories. Life in the city was a daily battle against damp rooms, spoiled water, polluted air, ceaseless labor, and the constant fear that tomorrow might be harder than today. When a bottle claimed to ease both the body's aches and the mind's unrest, people clutched it like a lantern in a darkened alley. Inside the chemist's shop, the labels were cut by hand from large sheets delivered weekly by a printer in Holborn. The ink was mixed fresh each morning in a shallow porcelain dish, and the apprentices dipped their nibs carefully, terrified of smudging a single word. A mistake meant starting over, and in a world where every detail was a reflection of a chemist's integrity, even a crooked letter could cost a man his customers. The labels were laid to dry on thin cotton cloth, filling the shop with the faint scent of paper and possibility. Yet there was something else hidden beneath that ink, something no label could say outright. At the bottom edge, printed in letters almost too small to notice, sat a single word that few paused to interpret: diacetyl morphine. It sounded clinical, sophisticated, scientific. A word that could only have come from laboratories filled with glassware and white coats, from bright minds working to ease suffering. But diacetyl morphine had another name, one that no Victorian mother or factory worker or trembling clerk would have recognized: heroin. The label did not lie. It simply told the truth, gently enough, that people leaned closer instead of stepping back. By late afternoon, the chemist's shop hummed with the rhythm of commerce. A lamplit glow washed over the rows of bottles, making the labels shimmer softly like invitations. Customers studied the words as if reading instructions from a trusted friend. An older man with a hacking cough traced the looping letters with a trembling finger. A young woman, pale from sleepless nights, whispered the promises under her breath. A father bought 2 bottles at once, nodding solemnly as though accepting a burden he could finally ease. Each of them left with the same reassurance printed neatly across paper: gentle, safe, effective. And though none of them knew it yet, those labels were the first step toward a different kind of suffering, a quiet hunger that would grow in the shadows of London's fog and gaslight. By the time the truth surfaced, the labels had already done their work. Words can heal, but in Victorian London, they also opened the door to a poison disguised as comfort. The fog had settled heavily over Whitechapel when Margaret Turner stepped out of her narrow doorway, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders and her youngest child pressed close against her chest. The baby's breath came in small, rapid bursts, a faint rasp hiding beneath each inhale. London's winter had not been kind to the Turner family, or to anyone living in the cramped brick rows where coal smoke drifted so thickly it coated the lungs quicker than any illness. But that morning, Margaret carried a quiet resolve. She was going to the chemist. The streets were slick with last night's frost. A lamplighter trudged past her, snuffing out the final lantern of dawn as if putting the night to rest. Shopkeepers lifted their shutters, shaking off sleep while milk carts rattled down the cobbles. Margaret kept her pace slow, careful. The child in her arms was fever-warm, his small body curled in discomfort as he coughed against her shoulder. Each cough made her flinch not out of fear, but out of tiredness. Weeks of restless nights had carved shadows beneath her eyes. Inside the chemist's shop, the warmth wrapped around her like a gentle hand. Shelves lined with bottles gleamed in the lamplight, and the faint scent of alcohol and peppermint drifted through the air. Margaret had been here before, once for her husband's pain after a fall at the docks, once for her eldest child's fever. Both had improved, or at least both had slept. That was enough in a world where time to rest was rare. "Good morning, Mrs. Turner," the chemist greeted, adjusting his spectacles. He looked at her child with a familiar sympathy. "The cold's been cruel this week." "Yes," she whispered, rocking the baby gently. "He barely slept last night." The chemist nodded, as though he had already expected the answer. He reached behind the counter, his hand steady in its certainty, and lifted a small brown bottle as warm-looking as amber in candlelight. The label faced her graceful script, promising peace. 4 coughs, for pain, for restless sleep. Margaret hesitated only for the span of a breath. She had heard other mothers speak of it in quiet corners of tenement courtyards, how just a spoonful soothed a child like nothing else, how it loosened the tight grip of coughing and granted hours of deep, peaceful slumber, how it felt like a blessing in a city that offered few. "Just a little," the chemist said, as though reading her thoughts. "It's gentle." She believed him. Margaret didn't have much in her life she could believe in, but this she trusted because she needed to, because when survival came down to moments of choice, a mother always reached for the thing that promised relief. She placed a few coins on the counter, far too many for her comfort, but the thought of hearing her baby's breathing ease was worth any cost. She tucked the bottle into her apron pocket and stepped back outside into the cold. The fog gathered around her again, but it felt softer now, as if the bottle's promise pushed it back. At home, the room was dim and close. A single coal burned in the grate, barely enough to warm the walls. Margaret uncorked the bottle. The scent drifted out, sweet, warm, comforting. The baby whimpered. Her hands trembled not with fear, but with hope, worn thin. She dipped the spoon, just a little, just enough. The child's cries softened almost instantly, his breathing easing as his eyelids grew heavy. Margaret watched as his tiny body relaxed into her arms. Relief washed over her in a long, trembling exhale. For the first time in weeks, the room felt still. She didn't know that inside that soft amber glow, behind that elegant script, she had given her child something far stronger than any mother should unknowingly offer. Something that calmed too deeply, something that soothed with a price. But in that moment, Margaret Turner only felt gratitude. She had trusted the cure because in Victorian London, trust was the only medicine a mother could afford. Dr. Alistair Whitcomb always arrived before sunrise, long before the hospital wards stirred with the restless groans of patients or the hurried footsteps of nurses. He liked those quiet hours when the corridors still held echoes of last night's sighs, and the lamps cast pools of warm, flickering amber along the tiled floors. In those moments, the hospital felt less like a battleground against disease, and more like a sanctuary where the future waited patiently to be discovered. And at the heart of that future, Dr. Whitcomb believed, was a new medicine the world was only just beginning to understand. He stood in his office now, coat buttoned against the lingering chill, his eyes fixed on a row of small brown bottles arranged neatly on his wooden desk. They gleamed in the soft lamplight, each one filled with a syrup so clear and elegant it looked like crystallized sunlight. He had received them only days before samples from a German pharmaceutical company, eager to showcase their latest innovation in pain relief. A refined extract, they said, derived from opium but purified, perfected, made safe, a miracle of modern chemistry. Whitcomb had watched his patients suffer for years. He had seen men crushed by machinery, women ravaged by childbirth, children gasping through nights of fever and fits. Pain was a constant presence in the wards, heavy, unrelenting, and cruel. Morphine helped, yes, but its side effects could be vicious. Laudanum eased suffering, but it dulled minds and left patients fogged for days. This new substance, however, the company claimed it acted without the dangers, a painkiller without addiction, a sedative without harm, a blessing without a curse. He wanted to believe it. Every doctor did. The first patient he tried it on was a factory worker named Daniel Hayes, a man whose arm had been mangled by the gears of a textile machine. He had come into the ward pale and shaking, teeth clenched so tightly that Whitcomb feared they might crack. When the doctor administered the new remedy, the change was nothing short of extraordinary. Within minutes, Daniel's breathing slowed, his muscles unclenched, his voice softened. The agony that moments before had twisted his face into a mask of terror faded as though swept away by a warm tide. "Doctor," Daniel whispered through half-closed eyes, I can breathe again." The relief in his voice was almost childlike. For Whitcomb, it felt like witnessing a revelation. Word spread quickly among the hospital staff. Nurses watched in astonishment as patients fell asleep gently, without the violent tremors or delirium that accompanied laudanum. Surgeons took note of how smoothly fresh bandages could be applied when the medicine was used. Even the hospital matron, ordinarily stern and skeptical, paused to observe the soothing effect it had on mothers, weeping beside sick children. "Remarkable," she murmured, adjusting her starched cap. And so the little, brown bottles began to disappear from Whitcomb's supply shelf faster than he had anticipated. He ordered more, then more again. Each shipment arrived with polite letters praising the doctor for embracing the future of healing. Each bottle carried the same elegant script, the same promises, the same comforting aura of scientific triumph. But late at night, after he extinguished the lamps and the ward slipped into uneasy silence, Whitcomb found himself lingering at patients' bedsides. He watched how deeply they slept, how still their bodies grew, too still, sometimes. He observed the way they clung to him the next day, asking when they could receive another dose. He heard their voices tremble not with pain, but with yearning. He told himself it was because the medicine worked too well. He told himself it was progress, but part of him, a small, whispering part he tried to ignore, wondered if miracles should ever come this easily. Still, he wiped his spectacles, straightened his coat, and prepared another dose. London demanded relief, and he had found something that provided it. Whatever else it brought, he would discover later. For now, the doctor believed in the miracle. The night was colder than most, the kind of cold that slipped through cracks in brick and bone alike. Thomas Wilkes felt it settle into his joints as he made his way home from the docks, his boots heavy with mud and the ache in his back pulsing like a slow, dull hammer. The day had been long, too long, hauling crates until his muscles screamed and his breath came in ragged gasps. By the time the lamps along the river began to burn low, Thomas could barely stand straight. He limped past shuttered pubs and darkened windows, his breath forming pale ghosts in the air. Every step sent a tremor through his ribs, a reminder of the injury he had earned weeks before when a crate slipped from a hoist and struck him like a blow from a giant's fist. Since then, sleep had become a stranger. Pain sat with him every night, whispering bitterness into his dreams. Tonight, however, he carried something different in his coat pocket, something the chemist had claimed would help him rest. A little brown bottle. He reached his small, drafty room at the top of a crooked staircase, pushing the door closed behind him with a tired grunt. The hearth was cold, the bed was narrow, but on the table beneath the window sat a chipped cup and the bottle he had purchased earlier that evening. He pulled it out now, holding it up to the faint moonlight. The liquid inside glowed softly, amber and inviting. The label promised comfort, relief, rest. Thomas uncorked it with a quiet pop, hesitating only long enough to remember the chemist's instructions. 1 teaspoon, as needed. He poured it carefully, the syrup catching the lamplight with a gentle shimmer. The smell that rose from it was sweet, oddly sweet, and the moment it touched his tongue, a warmth spread through him that felt almost like being wrapped in a thick wool blanket after standing too long in the winter air. Within moments, the ache in his back softened. The tightness in his chest loosened. His legs grew light, as if the weight of the entire day evaporated into the room around him. He sank onto the edge of the bed, blinking slowly, marveling at the sudden stillness within his body. For the first time in weeks, there was no sharp jab behind his ribs, no throbbing in his spine, no tremor in his hands. It felt like silence, not the silence of an empty room or a quiet street, but the kind that descends after a storm, when every sound is washed clean and left shimmering with calm. Thomas leaned back, exhaling a long, trembling breath. His eyes closed, his thoughts wandered gently, drifting as though his mind had become untethered, floating freely through the dim, fog-softened night. He told himself he would only rest for a moment, just until the warmth faded, just until he could feel his limbs again. But the warmth did not fade. It deepened. His heartbeat slowed to a rhythm so soft he barely noticed it. His eyelids grew impossibly heavy. The room blurred at the edges, slipping into a haze that felt too comforting, too peaceful, too effortless. Thomas sank deeper into the mattress, swallowed whole by relief so profound that it frightened him, though only faintly, like a candle flickering in a distant window. When he woke hours later, the lamp had burned out, and dawn had begun to stretch pale fingers across the rooftops. The pain was gone, completely gone. He sat up, amazed, touching his side as if expecting the ache to be hiding beneath the surface. But there was nothing. For the first time in months, he stood without wincing. He stared at the little brown bottle on the table, half empty now, and felt a flush of gratitude, disbelief, and something else he could not yet name. Something like hunger. He told himself it was simply relief, but London was learning, one person at a time, that some miracles give too much too quickly and take far more in return. By the time the city lamps burned low and the fog settled like a quilt over London's narrow lanes, the chemist's shop on Dorset Street had already closed for the night. Its shutters were drawn, its door bolted, and the brass bell that usually chimed with each customer's arrival hung still in the silence. But behind the locked front room, past the rows of jars, past the glass cabinets of ointments and powders, another door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit space where business never truly ended. Mr. Holling moved carefully around the small back room, lighting a single oil lamp that cast a muted glow over the cluttered table. This room was nothing like the tidy, respectable shop out front. Here, ledgers lay open, their pages filled with scribbled orders. Boxes of empty bottles lined the walls. A faint, metallic scent drifted through the air, mixing with alcohol fumes. Yet Mr. Holling worked with a calm, practiced ease, as though the shadows themselves approved of his nightly rituals. He had discovered months ago that the new remedy, the clear, soothing one that made customers return with grateful eyes, was more profitable than anything he had ever stocked. People came back quickly, too quickly. At first, he believed it was simply because the medicine worked wonderfully. But soon, he noticed things he could not ignore. Trembling hands sliding coins across the counter, breathless voices asking for larger bottles, customers returning twice in a single day with excuses that grew thinner each time. Still, demand was demand, and a wise businessman learned to follow it. He sat at his backroom table now, mixing ingredients with the precision of a surgeon. The syrup glistened in the lamplight, thick and golden, swirling gently as he poured it into the waiting bottles. Each one filled neatly, perfectly, as though eager to be part of the growing appetite outside his shop. London was restless, weary, aching, coughing, sleepless, and this little brown bottle offered the kind of peace the city hadn't felt in generations. When the bottles were filled, he wiped their sides clean and affixed the labels carefully, one by one. The elegant script seemed to glow under the lamplight. For coughs, for pain, for restless sleep. The promises looked innocent enough, gentle, harmless. A mother could hold one without suspicion. A doctor could prescribe one without hesitation. And an addict, though neither chemist nor customer would use that word, could cradle it with a devotion so fierce it bordered on prayer. It was not just the poor who returned after hours. Well-dressed gentlemen knocked discreetly on the shop's back door, their hats pulled low. Ladies from respectable households sent their maids with hushed instructions. Dock workers came too, slipping coins into Holling's palm with eyes that avoided his. Every hour, Florence Nightingale's vision of medical progress collided with the reality of Victorian survival. Mr. Holling knew what he was doing. At least, he knew enough. He recognized the signs: jittering fingers, hollowed cheeks, voices just a touch too eager. But he told himself what many men in his position would have said, that he was helping people, that they needed it, that he was easing the city's suffering in a way no preacher, no politician, no philanthropist ever had. And if he happened to profit handsomely from the need, well, that was simply business. But as he corked the final bottle, he paused, listening to the distant hum of the city beyond his shop walls. London was changing. The medicine was working its quiet influence, creeping from tenement rooms to mansions, from sickbeds to parlors, from hospital wards to factory floors. The chemist was not shaping that change. He was merely feeding it. He blew out the lamp. The room fell into darkness, save for the faint amber glow of the little brown bottles. They gleamed like secrets, tiny, dangerous, irresistible, waiting for the next pair of trembling hands to claim them. By the time night settled over Spitalfields, the streets looked nothing like the bustling avenues they were by day. The market stalls had been packed away, the shouts of traders long faded into memory, and only the glow of the distant gas lamps remained, hanging in the fog like dim stars trying to hold their place in the sky. It was in this hour, the strange, fragile space between midnight and dawn, that the sleepwalkers emerged. No one called them that aloud, of course, but the name lived quietly in murmured conversations, in hushed tones exchanged between neighbors leaning out of windows, watching the figures who drifted through the night. They moved slowly, softly, as though wrapped in invisible wool. Their bodies swayed with each step, their eyes half-lidded, unfocused. Some carried parcels, others clutched the lapels of their coats as though steadying themselves. All of them shared the same distant look, a kind of fog behind the eyes that matched the fog rolling along the cobblestones. These were the people who had found relief in the little brown bottles, and now they walked through the streets in its lingering embrace. Missus, Forsyth, who lived above the butcher's shop, was one of them. Her husband had died the year prior, leaving her with 3 children and a heart that never stopped tightening. The remedy had first helped her sleep after so many restless nights. Then it had helped her endure her grief. Then, though she never admitted it, it had become the only thing that made her mornings bearable. She moved through the fog in her nightdress and shawl, her feet barely aware of the cobbles beneath them. A few doors down, Alfred Pike, a young apprentice with ink-stained fingernails, wandered with the same hollow calm. He had taken the medicine for headaches, brought on by long hours at the print shop. What he hadn't expected was the warmth, that floating sense of being lifted above the heaviness of life. Now, even when the headaches were gone, the pull of that warmth drew him out at night, guiding his steps without thought. But it was not only the poor or grieving who drifted through the lamplit haze. The fog parted to reveal silhouettes of men in fine coats, their collars turned up against the cold. A solicitor with trembling hands cupped in his pockets, a diplomat's wife, eyes vacant, walking as though hypnotized by the quiet. They all belonged to different worlds by day, but at night, under the spell of the same amber medicine, their steps matched in eerie rhythm. A constable on the corner watched them go, unsure whether to intervene or simply avert his eyes. He had seen drunks, certainly rowdy, stumbling, shouting. These were nothing like that. These figures were gentle, silent, drifting, too peaceful, he thought, too calm. He never stopped them. Part of him feared breaking the spell. Another part feared understanding it. In the tenements, children pressed their faces to cracked windows, whispering about the strange procession below. In the upper rooms of boarding houses, old men smoking cheap pipe tobacco would pause mid-drag, shaking their heads in disapproval but saying nothing. Everyone saw the sleepwalkers. Few understood them. The little brown bottles had promised rest, and they had delivered so completely that the boundary between waking and sleep blurred in ways London had never seen. These night wanderers were not drunk, not ill, not mad. They were suspended, held gently in a haze of relief that softened every edge of reality. But beneath that softness was something else, something growing. For every night they walked like dreamers. The mornings grew harder, the brightness harsher, the world heavier. And so the cycle continued: fog, bottle, drift, dawn. In time, the street would remember them only as shadows. But for now, they moved like ghosts between the gas lamps, a gentle procession of souls caught between pain and the dangerous comfort that had taken its place. In the quiet houses of Bloomsbury and Kensington, where lace curtains softened the light and polished floors reflected the glow of gas lamps, another kind of suffering lived behind closed doors, one wrapped in silk and silence. These were the parlours where Victorian women gathered in the late afternoons, their voices gentle, their movements precise, their griefs politely hidden beneath layers of etiquette. And in these same parlours, the little brown bottle had found a different sort of welcome. It often began with exhaustion, the kind that settled deep within the bones of women expected to be perfect wives, tireless mothers, elegant hostesses, and quiet keepers of the home. Society praised them for their grace, yet ignored the weight of the roles they carried. Sleeplessness, melancholy, nerves, hysteria. The era had many names for what burdened them, but almost no mercy. Doctors prescribed fresh air. Clergymen recommended prayer. Neighbors whispered that a woman should simply persevere. And so, when the new medicine appeared in apothecaries and on doctors' shelves, promising calmness and relief, the women welcomed it as if it were a long-awaited friend. On a mild evening in early spring, the parlour of the Brantham residence filled with the quiet rustle of dresses as Mrs. Eleanor Brantham's neighbours arrived for tea. The room was arranged just as she liked it, pale wallpaper of climbing roses, a gleaming piano untouched since Christmas, porcelain figurines arranged symmetrically on the mantelpiece. She had spent the morning ensuring that not a speck of dust remained. Appearances were important. They kept the world from seeing how empty her nights had become. As the conversation drifted between gossip and polite laughter, Eleanor excused herself for a moment. She stepped through a side door into a smaller sitting room, a private space where the curtains were drawn tighter and the air held a faint sweetness. On the side table, nestled beside her embroidery basket, sat a familiar bottle. Her hands lingered over it. Just a sip, she told herself. Enough to soften the restlessness that had clung to her since dawn. Enough to quiet the tightness in her chest that no physician's advice had ever eased. The amber liquid touched her tongue, and almost instantly the heaviness melted away. When she returned to the parlor, her smile was softer, her shoulders relaxed. The other women didn't ask what she had done. They simply recognized the shift. Many of them knew the same comfort. Mrs. Langford, who rarely spoke of the child she lost years ago, kept her own bottle tucked in her sewing drawer. Mrs. Harrow, whose husband's temper grew sharper each season, relied on 1 teaspoon before gatherings so her hands wouldn't tremble. Even young Clara Whitby, barely 20, used the medicine to quiet her racing thoughts when the pressure of constant expectations grew suffocating. The parlors glowed with warmth and elegance, soft conversations, clinking china, faint perfume in the air yet beneath the surface. Something fragile and unsettling pulsed quietly. Eyes seemed to lose focus for a moment too long. Laughter slipped easily into silence. Conversations drifted like fog, without direction or intention. They looked serene. They were fading, not in dramatic fashion, not suddenly or violently, but gradually, like candle flames dimming in a room where the air has grown thin. The women slept deeply, spoke softly, smiled gently, and each day they returned to the bottle with a little more devotion. Their husbands praised the change. Their doctors encouraged it. Society called it refinement, tranquility, grace. But the medicine didn't make them graceful. It made them quiet, too quiet. And in the parlors where lace curtains fluttered softly against the windows, Victorian London watched its women become shadows, elegant, delicate, and slowly erased by the cure they believed would keep them whole. The ledger was older than the shop itself. Its leather cover, once a deep mahogany, had worn into a softened, uneven shade, edges frayed, corners blunted by years of handling. Inside, the pages were yellowed, brittle in the way that paper becomes when it has absorbed the weight of too many human needs. Ink stained its parchment like dark veins, stretching across neat columns of names, quantities, and dates. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than the ordinary bookkeeping of a respectable Victorian apothecary. But anyone who read carefully enough would notice patterns, small, quiet, unsettling patterns that hinted at the tide rising beneath London's skin. Mr. Holling kept the ledger locked in a drawer beneath the counter, though he opened it often. Each morning, before the bell chimed its first greeting, he dipped his pen into ink and recorded the day's orders with the precision of a man who understood the delicate line between necessity and indulgence. His handwriting was elegant, practiced, a kind of calligraphy he had learned as an apprentice in his youth. It lent dignity to the pages, as though the pain and desperation that brought customers to his door were somehow softened by the grace of his script. But lately, the names returning to the ledger appeared too frequently. Mrs. Forsyth, 1 bottle. 3 days later, another. Then again, 2 days after that. Alfred Pike, half-ounce tincture, then a full ounce, then 2. Even Dr. Whitcomb, respected and cautious, had begun ordering larger quantities for hospital use, though Mr. Holling suspected the doctor himself relied on small doses during sleepless nights. The entries multiplied like shadows lengthening at dusk. Holling traced his fingers over them sometimes, sensing the growing dependency even if he refused to acknowledge it aloud. The numbers spoke with a clarity he chose not to hear. By midday, when the shop bustled with customers, the ledger became a silent witness to London's unravelling. The bell rang constantly, mothers with tired eyes, factory workers rubbing stiff hands, clerks pale from long hours under gaslight. Each time the bottle passed from his counter to their grasp, Holling made a careful note. The ledger did not judge. It simply remembered, but it was in the evenings, after the shutters closed and the streets outside softened into fog, that the ledger's entries seemed to echo through the dim shop. Holling would sit at his desk in the back room, oil lamp flickering, and leaf through the pages. The ink danced like ghostly footprints. He could see the rhythm of dependence forming the shortening intervals, the increasing doses, the tremble in the signatures of those who paid in haste. He told himself it was because the medicine worked. A successful remedy always prompted return customers. Was it not the goal of every chemist to ease suffering, to give relief where none had existed? Yet beneath the comfort of his reasoning, another truth stirred. The ledger revealed more than pain being soothed. It revealed comfort, becoming hunger. Outside the shop, London hummed with its usual unrest, coughing, shivering, aching, always aching. The fog rolled in from the river, muting the gas lamps and blurring the line between street and shadow. The city needed help. The city needed rest. And the ledger showed exactly how willingly it reached for the little brown bottle to find it. By the time Holling closed the book, each night, he was no longer certain whether he was recording transactions or documenting the quiet spread of something more dangerous, something that crept through London not with noise or violence, but with soft promises written in elegant ink. The ledger remembered every promise, and someday London would have to confront the cost it had recorded so faithfully. By the time London surrendered to the blue-grey hush of evening, the city's buildings had begun their nightly murmuring. It wasn't a sound anyone could name, nor a voice one could follow, more a feeling that lived in the plaster, in the brick, in the narrow alleys where the fog pooled thickest, in the tenements and boarding houses where dozens of lives were stacked one atop another. Whispers travelled more easily than light. They drifted beneath doorframes, through thin walls, across stairwells worn down by countless weary footsteps. And by now, many of those whispers carried the same quiet refrain: the bottle helps. On Vine Street, in a cramped brick building with sagging floors, the walls heard everything. At night, when lamps dimmed and the city's restless silence pressed itself into every room, you could hear coughing from the first floor, restless shifting from the second, and soft, shuddering breaths from the third. The walls kept their secrets well, they had no choice, but even they sensed the change that had begun spreading from room to room. It started in the Holloway household on the ground floor. Mr. Holloway's chronic lung trouble had grown so severe that his wife rarely slept, tending to him through the long hours of darkness. Then came the bottle, the amber remedy the chemist insisted would soothe him. And it did, too well. His coughing lessened, his pain dulled, his breathing softened so faintly that Mrs. Holloway often checked his pulse in fright. The walls listened as she whispered her relief. They also listened when she gave herself a spoonful the next night. Above them lived the Davenports, a young couple new to the city. They weren't sick, not in the way illness made itself known, but city life weighted them with a constant tension, a strain from the noise and the work and the unending uncertainty. They tried the remedy one night, just to sleep. The next night, they tried it again. And then, without meaning to, they took it not for need, but for comfort. The walls did not judge, they only absorbed. On the third floor, in a room barely larger than a cupboard, an aging seamstress named Lottie lived alone. Her back ached from long days at the dressmaker's, her fingers swollen from years of stitching cloth by candlelight. When she finally tried the little brown bottle after weeks of hearing her neighbors praise it in muffled conversations through the floorboards, the soft sigh that escaped her lips was audible even to the hallway. She slept for nearly 12 hours, deeper than she had since girlhood. The walls felt that sigh and held onto it like memory. In the evenings, when the building settled into its familiar creaks and groans, the whispers between rooms took on a pattern, a rustle of blankets, a soft thud of bottle against wood, a murmured prayer of gratitude, a faint gasp as the warmth washed through tired limbs. The walls felt every sound, every relieved breath, every quiet confession shaped in the dark. Soon, the building moved in a strange rhythm. Residents grew calmer in the evenings, slower, quieter, drifting through their routines as though wrapped in wool. Conversations softened, arguments faded, children cried less, adults slept more. It should have been peaceful, But peace had edges, sharp ones, if you listened closely enough. Sometimes the walls heard shaking hands, fumbling with corks. Sometimes they felt the uneven footsteps of a man rising too quickly from a dream-heavy sleep. Sometimes the whispers carried not comfort, but desperation, a plea between breaths. Just one more sip, just a little more. By then, the walls of Vine Street understood something the people inside did not. London was changing, not loudly, not suddenly, but through small sounds, small sips, small reliefs that spread from one room to the next. The little brown bottle had become part of the building, part of the tenement's heartbeat, part of the city's nightly ritual. And the walls, old and tired but ever listening, knew a truth the rest of London had yet to grasp. Whispers are only whispers until the whole city begins to speak them. The mornings in Shoreditch always began with sound carts rattling over uneven stones, vendors calling out the day's wares, and, most familiar of all, the chorus of coughing that drifted from homes wedged tightly between factories and workshops. It was a harsh kind of noise, raw and unfiltered, echoing from windows cracked open to let out the night's stale air. The city coughed like a living creature struggling to clear its lungs. And for years, Samuel Blythe had been part of that chorus. Samuel was a cooper by trade, shaping barrels from sun-up to sundown. Sawdust clung to his clothes, crept into the creases of his hands, and settled in his chest until breathing felt like drawing air through cloth. His cough had grown so constant that his neighbors identified him by sound alone. But one morning, one ordinary, fog-softened morning, the familiar cough did not greet the dawn. It was his wife, Mara, who noticed first. She stood over their small stove, warming porridge, waiting for the sharp bark of Samuel's cough to rattle the walls like it always did. Instead, she heard the quiet hum of the kettle and Samuel's steady footsteps. When he entered the room, his breath came easily, too easily for a man who had spent half a lifetime inhaling wood, dust, and city smoke. "You're quiet this morning," she said cautiously, as though silence itself might shatter. He shrugged, almost sheepishly. "Slept well, better than I have in years." Her eyes drifted to the mantel, to the little brown bottle. She didn't ask if he had taken it. She already knew. Everyone did. The bottle's presence announced itself long before the truth was spoken. It sat among their few possessions like a visiting guest, unassuming, polite, yet impossible to ignore. Samuel ate slowly, testing this newfound calm in his chest. There was no tightness, no scratch of dust, no ache. It was as though someone had opened a window inside him and let in a breath of clean air, something London had not offered in decades. "Well then," Mara whispered, stirring the pot though the porridge was already done. "Thank God for a bit of mercy." Mercy. That was the word the city favoured. A small mercy in an unforgiving world. At the cooperage, Samuel worked with a vigour that surprised his fellow labourers. They watched him lift staves and rings with effortless motion. No coughing fits interrupted his rhythm. No wheezing sent him outside for air. Even the foreman, a man of few words and fewer compliments, nodded at him with something close to approval. "What's gotten into you?" one of the younger workers asked as Samuel cleaned his tools. "Just slept well, that's all," Samuel replied. But his hand drifted toward his coat pocket where the bottle waited, and he felt a quiet, secret gratitude. The absence of pain was intoxicating. By evening, as he walked home through lamplit fog, Samuel kept touching his chest, marveling at its ease. He took another dose before supper, telling himself it was only to maintain the comfort he had already earned. Mara didn't question it. She saw the brightness in his eyes, the way he stood taller, breathed deeper. But she also noticed something else, something faint, something small. Each time Samuel reached for the bottle, his hand trembled. Not from sickness, but from anticipation. That night, as he slept without a single cough, the city felt strangely quiet, as if London itself were holding its breath. Samuel did not know yet that the cough had not vanished. It had only been replaced, softly, sweetly, by a need that would grow louder with every silent morning that followed. Agnes Bell had not slept through the night in almost 3 years. Sleep, once a gentle visitor, had become a stranger who knocked but never stayed, slipping away just as her breathing slowed, abandoning her to the long, echoing hours of the London dark. Her husband worked nights at the printing works, leaving her alone in their narrow Clerkenwell room with only the ticking of the mantel clock to keep her company. But the clock offered no comfort. It only marked the passing of hours she could not rest in. Night after night, Agnes lay awake, staring at the ceiling, as the city hummed around her. She heard neighbours arguing through the thin walls. She heard footsteps on the stairs. She heard the occasional distant carriage rattling down the cobblestones, long after respectable households had gone quiet. Her body grew weak from exhaustion, her thoughts frayed at the edges. She felt herself thinning as though her mind were a candle burning from both ends. Then, one grey morning, after a night spent pacing the floorboards until her feet ached, she went to the chemist. The remedy he sold her was simple, he said, gentle, harmless, a few drops in warm water before bed. "You'll sleep like a child," he promised with a kindly smile that made her believe him simply because she wanted to. That evening, Agnes bathed her face, brushed her hair, and settled into bed with the mixture trembling in her hands. The amber swirl of the medicine caught the candlelight glowing like the embers of a hearth she had never owned. It smelled faintly sweet, like something distant and forgotten from childhood. She drank it, and the world softened. The tightness in her chest loosened. The restless rush of her mind slowed. Her limbs became heavy, sinking into the mattress as though the bed itself had finally decided to hold her. For the first time in years, Agnes felt the warm pull of sleep descend without a battle. When she woke, sunlight was creeping across the room. She had slept through the night deeply, beautifully, uninterrupted. She cried from relief, and that night, she took the remedy again. Soon, the ritual became as familiar as breathing. Each evening, as the clock struck 10, Agnes poured the syrup carefully, watching it dissolve into water until it looked like weak tea. She drank it slowly, savoring the way peace unfurled inside her chest. Her dreams returned soft, simple things she had forgotten she was capable of having. But something else returned too. Hunger, not for food, nor for comfort, but for the quiet, clouded warmth that spread through her body with each sip, for the way it blurred the edges of her thoughts, turning her worries into faint murmurs she no longer needed to answer. The nights were no longer long or lonely. They simply disappeared. Yet, as the weeks passed, Agnes noticed subtle changes. She felt tired earlier, restless if she delayed her nightly ritual. Her hands trembled faintly when she prepared the dose. She began, adding a little more, just a half drop, then a full drop to keep the blissful heaviness from slipping away too quickly. Her friends remarked that she seemed calm, unusually calm. Her husband said she looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. Agnes brushed it off with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The sleepless nights had melted away, yes, dissolved like sugar in hot water, but in their place, something else had settled, an unseen thread tugging her toward the bottle each evening, a quiet dependency she didn't have the strength or the desire to question, because sleep was no longer a stranger. It was a promise, and Agnes Bell would do anything to keep it close. There was a part of London where the air always smelled faintly of yeast and damp stone. Brewery Lane, a narrow stretch tucked between the river and the old warehouses. By day, it was noisy. Barrels rolled over cobblestones, carts creaked under their loads, and the workers' shouts echoed against brick walls slick with condensation. But by night, the noise softened into something else, a hush, broken only by the low, wavering notes of a flute drifting through the fog. The piper was always there. No one knew his name anymore. Some said he had once been a musician in a modest orchestra. Others claimed he had played at taverns along the riverside before drink ruined his life. But those who lived near Brewery Lane knew the truth was neither so simple nor so cruel. His story was quieter, sadder, told only through the haunting melody that floated through the dark each night. He played because the music steadied him, and he needed the steadying more than ever. The piper leaned against a lamppost now, his coat patched at the elbows, his hat pulled low to guard against the cold. His fingers trembled slightly as they danced along the flute. The trembling never used to be there. It had started weeks ago, after he discovered the little brown bottle. He had taken it first for pain, a nagging soreness in his ribs that came from years of hard living and sleeping rough. The medicine had soothed it instantly, like warm hands pressed against cold skin. Then he had taken it again later that evening because it made the music feel richer, deeper, easier. The notes flowed with a silkiness he had forgotten he was capable of. Soon, the bottle became part of his nightly ritual. Melody, fog, warmth, another taste, another song. But tonight, as the fog curled around his legs like restless cats, something was different. The music wavered, his breath came shallow, and when he lowered the flute to catch his breath, he felt the familiar ache gnawing at his insides, a hollow, frantic pull that whispered for relief. He reached into his pocket. Empty. He checked again, more urgently this time, as if the bottle might reappear through sheer desperation. But there was nothing. No weight, no promise. Just the thin lining of his coat and the cold biting at his fingertips. The melody died mid-phrase. Across the lane, a pair of dock workers paused their conversation. They watched as the piper sagged against the lamppost, his breath forming shaky clouds. One whispered, "It's gotten him too," with a tone that held more pity than judgment. The piper straightened, trying to steady himself, pressing a hand to his ribs as if the pain were returning all at once. In truth, it wasn't pain he feared. It was the emptiness left behind when the medicine wore off, the clarity that felt too sharp, too heavy, too unbearable. He lifted the flute again, but his fingers wouldn't obey. The tremor had become a full, frantic shaking. The notes came out broken, jagged, like shards of sound scattering across the cobblestones. The fog swallowed them quickly. Finally, he stopped altogether. He pressed his back to the brick wall and slid down until he was sitting on the cold ground. His breath hitched, his eyes unfocused. He stared at his trembling hands as though they belonged to someone else. He needed the bottle, not for pain, not for warmth, but because it had become the only way to keep the silence at bay. Somewhere above him, a window opened, and a woman's worried face peered down. The piper didn't notice. Brewery Lane watched as he curled forward, shivering, the once beautiful melody forgotten. London had many tragedies, but few were as quiet or as invisible as the ones that walked on trembling legs through fog-choked streets, searching for the next drop of peace. And in the shadow of the warehouses, the piper waited for dawn, clutching the flute he could no longer play, listening to a city that no longer sounded like home. St. Mary's Infirmary sat at the bend of the river, like an old sentinel, tall, grey, draughty, and always humming with the quiet rhythm of suffering. Its corridors stretched long and narrow, the gas lamps flickering as if the building itself exhaled with every footfall. At night, when the city dimmed and the fog pressed its cold face against the windows, the nurses moved through the wards like ghosts in starched white, steady, practiced, and exhausted beyond measure. They carried burdens no one saw. They heard cries meant only for the dark, and in their pockets, many now carried a small, amber secret. It had begun innocently enough. The physicians used the remedy on patients, praising its gentle grip on pain. The results were undeniable. A man writhing with broken ribs fell into peaceful slumber. A mother hemorrhaging after childbirth sighed in relief for the first time in hours. Children burning with fever drifted into deep, quiet rest. The nurses saw suffering softened in ways they had never witnessed before. At first, they were wary. Nurses lived by caution, by instinct honed in long nights, by the memories of what happened when miracle cures proved false. But the results were too consistent, too immediate, too miraculous to ignore. One nurse, in particular, felt its pull more than the others. Her name was Evelyn Marsh. a woman who had worn her uniform proudly for 7 years. She had been trained under strict matrons who taught that a nurse must never show weakness, never waver, never allow the weight of suffering to sink beneath her skin. But Evelyn felt everything. Each cough, each cry, each set of trembling hands, they lingered in her like echoes long after her shifts ended. It was Sister Aldrin, the ward's sternest nurse, who offered her the remedy the first time. "You look worn thin, girl," she muttered, pressing the bottle gently into Evelyn's palm. "Take a spoon. Just one. You need rest as much as any patient." Evelyn obeyed. The warmth that spread through her was unlike anything she had known. Her thoughts softened, her breath deepened, and for the first time in months, she slept without dreaming of the ward's suffering faces. She woke feeling restored, not fully, but enough to believe she had been given a lifeline. Soon, other nurses followed. They justified it easily. Their days were long, their feet bruised, their hands raw, their hearts stretched thin by the constant needs of others. If the medicine helped them sleep, if it helped them function, if it steadied their nerves during endless nights of tending to the dying, how could it be wrong? But the bottle had a way of shifting from relief to ritual. Evelyn noticed the first change during a night shift. Her hands trembled as she tried to thread a needle to fix a torn bandage. She blamed exhaustion. She blamed hunger. Anything but the truth. Another night, when a patient moaned in agony, she found herself gripping the bottle in her apron pocket, comforted simply by its presence, even before giving the dose. The other nurses whispered too. Sister Aldrin, who prided herself on discipline, now walked with unnerving calm, her eyes distant and heavy-lidded. Young Nurse Harriet, usually full of chatter, had grown strangely quiet, her steps floating more than walking. Even Matron Gilchrist, who had once scolded nurses for relying too heavily on laudanum, now poured herself a careful measure each evening, calling it a necessary aid. The wards changed as the nurses changed. Patients slept deeply. Nurses drifted. The night grew quieter, unnaturally so. It wasn't that the medicine stopped pain. It stopped everything. And in the dim glow of the infirmary's gas lamps, Evelyn Marsh realized something she could not bring herself to speak aloud. The nurses were becoming as dependent on the bottle as the patients they tended. But the city outside needed them, and the bottle, all too quietly, had begun to take them instead. By the time the fog rolled in from the Thames each evening, Henry Alcott could be found standing behind the counter of his shop on Cheapside, counting coins with the steady rhythm of a man who had long memorized the weight of silver. His business dealt in fabrics and notions, bolts of wool, rolls of ribbon, delicate lace that the ladies of the district adored. For years he had built his trade on charm, consistency, and a pair of bright, sharp eyes that missed nothing. But sharpness fades quietly, and for Henry it began the moment the little brown bottle entered his life. His troubles were modest at first, just a persistent aching in his wrists from lifting crates, a stiffness in his shoulders from long days spent hunched over his ledger. He dismissed it as the price of running a successful shop. But one winter morning, after spending a sleepless night shifting restlessly beneath heavy blankets, he visited the chemist across the street. The chemist gave him a small amber bottle and a reassuring nod. "Just a spoon," he said. "It'll ease the pain, help you sleep." Henry took his first dose that night. The warmth filled him like a rising tide. His muscles loosened, his worries grew distant, and his breath fell into a rhythm as peaceful as a lullaby. When morning came, he felt renewed, refreshed, alive in a way he hadn't in years. He told himself he would use it only when necessary. But necessity in London was a slippery thing. Within weeks, he reached for the bottle more often, a sip before bed, a sip when the shop grew too busy, a sip when a difficult customer raised his voice, a sip when the fog outside made him feel unbearably alone. Slowly, his bright eyes began to dim. The clarity he once wore like armor softened into something glassy and unfocused. Customers noticed first. One afternoon, Mrs. Pembroke, a regular who prided herself on observing minute details, paused mid-conversation, watching Henry attempt to measure a length of muslin. His hands trembled slightly. He blinked too slowly, as though dragging himself back from a faraway place. "Mr. Alcott," she murmured gently, "are you quite well?" Henry forced a smile, straightening his waistcoat. "Just tired, madam. These winter days are long." But his reflection in the shop window betrayed him. His pupils were wider than they should be in afternoon light. His eyelids drooped. His once quick gaze meandered vaguely, hovering above customers' shoulders rather than meeting their eyes. In the evenings, when the shop closed and Cheapside emptied into a haze of lamplight and drifting soot, Henry sat at his counter long after he should have gone home. The ledger lay open before him, but the numbers blurred. He reread the same lines again and again, without comprehension. Sometimes he forgot to lock the door, sometimes he forgot to count the till, sometimes he forgot he had already taken a dose and took another. His assistant, young Edward Marsh, tried not to stare at the growing shadow beneath Henry's eyes, or the slight slur that touched the edges of sentences spoken near closing time. He knew better than to ask. In Victorian London, a man's private struggles remained private, hidden behind polite nods and closed doors. But the shop felt different now. The vibrant hum of trade had softened into a drowsy quiet. Bolts of cloth went uncut on the shelves, deliveries piled up in the back room, and Henry's eyes, once the sharpest in Cheapside, no longer sparkled with calculation, ambition, or even fatigue. They had taken on a different look entirely, a searching look, a hungry look, a look that lingered too long on the bottle he kept tucked beneath the counter. It wasn't pain he was healing anymore. It wasn't sleeplessness he was soothing. It was the emptiness left behind when the medicine wore off. And as Henry Alcott locked the shop, one fog-soaked night, hands shaking despite the calm, his dose promised he understood the truth. His dimming eyes could no longer hide. The bottle had changed him, and it was far from finished. London's fog had always been a familiar presence, a grey veil that slipped between rooftops, coiled around lamp-posts, and softened the world into a watercolour of silhouettes and shadows. But by the middle of that peculiar winter, the fog felt different, heavier, closer, almost as if it were conspiring with the city's newest secret, wrapping it in quiet protection so no one would see how quickly the habit had taken root. Fog had a way of blurring truths, and London, drowning in its own exhaustion, was grateful for anything that blurred. On the narrow streets of Limehouse, where ships unloaded goods from every corner of the world, the fog drifted off the water each evening like a living tide. It swallowed alleyways whole and muffled the footsteps of sailors stumbling back to their lodgings after long months at sea. And hidden among them were men who clutched the little brown bottle in their coat pockets like a talisman, something warm, comforting, steady in a city that was anything but. Jonathan Griggs, a dockhand with a laugh as rough as rope fibre, had once been known for his thunderous voice, but lately his voice had grown soft, as if wrapped in cotton. He moved slowly through the fog, shoulders slumped, eyes half-lidded. His friends joked he was becoming a proper ghost, though none of them laughed for long. They couldn't. Too many of them walked with the same drifting gait, their breath tinted faintly sweet by the medicine they now depended on. The fog hid their unsteadiness. It hid their shaking hands. It hid the bottle that passed quietly from sailor to sailor after a hard shift. On the other side of the city, in Belgravia, where polished carriages rolled past marble steps, the fog worked differently. It softened the edges of manicured streets, cloaked the tremor in Lady Pembroke's fingers as she lifted her lace-trimmed handkerchief, and disguised the faint glassiness in her eyes as she greeted guests at her door. Her physician had prescribed the remedy months ago for nerves, he'd said. In the vague, delicate way doctors spoke of a lady's distress. But Lady Pembroke no longer needed a reason to use it. She slipped away from dinners, from conversations, from the weight of expectations to take just a drop more than the night before. The fog outside her window blurred her reflection in the glass. She liked it that way. In tenement rows, the fog moved like a companion. It seeped beneath the cracks in doors, curling around bare floorboards as residents lay in bed waiting for the warmth to return. It muffled the sound of corks popping open in the dark. It softened the tiny gasp of relief that followed each dose. It hid shaking limbs beneath its grey embrace. It also hid the truth that London was no longer just tired or poor or ill. It was becoming dependent. In the pubs of Whitechapel, where the lamps burned through layers of smoke and murmur, the fog outside the windows turned everything into silhouettes. Men slumped over tables, women swaying as they rose to leave. Young clerks with ink-stained fingers humming softly, their minds floating just beyond reach. Patrons blamed the weather, the workday, the ale. No one blamed the bottle. Not yet. And when the fog thickened at midnight, swallowing the city whole, it carried with it hundreds of Londoners drifting in and out of clarity, their steps slow, their breaths shallow, their thoughts softened into something that felt dangerously close to peace. The fog hid the habit well. It would hide it until the month the fog lifted and left the city exposed, trembling, hungry, and suddenly aware of how deeply the bottle had woven itself into its bones. But London did not know that yet. For now, it walked through the grey haze, unaware, trusting the fog the way it trusted the medicine, blindly, gratefully, and far too completely. At the uppermost corner of Hanbury Street, in a cramped room overlooking the narrow lane below, lived a young seamstress named Eliza Merrin. She was 17, slight as a willow branch, with nimble fingers that stitched faster than most women twice her age. From dawn until long after the lamps were lit, Eliza sat by the window with her sewing basket, working until her vision blurred and the thread wavered between her fingers. Hers was not a life of extravagance, but she carried herself with a quiet determination, the kind that only those who had learned to endure could possess. But endurance had its limits, and exhaustion was a patient thief. For months, Eliza had woken each morning with a heaviness in her limbs that no amount of strong tea could lift. The endless hours of sewing, the relentless strain on her eyes, the cramped, drafty room she called home, all of it had chipped away at her until her youth felt used up before it had properly begun. She tried resting her hands. She tried soaking them in warm water. She tried closing her eyes between stitches. Nothing helped. Then one evening, as she returned from delivering a bundle of finished garments, she passed the chemist's shop. The door stood half open, letting out a warm glow of lamplight and the faint scent of herbs and alcohol. On impulse, or perhaps desperation, she stepped inside. The chemist recommended the same little brown bottle he sold to half the neighborhood. "For your nerves," he said gently, "and for sleep. Your hands tremble. You need rest more than anything." Eliza didn't argue. She purchased the bottle with money she should have saved, clutching it tightly as she walked home through the swirling fog. That night, she took a careful sip. Warmth unfurled in her chest like a small flame. Her breathing slowed. The ache in her fingers softened until it disappeared entirely. She slept deeper than she had since childhood, a dreamless, velvety darkness that held her like a cradle. The next morning, she woke feeling light, as though the world had softened its edges. She stitched faster, smoother, with a calm she had long forgotten. Her employer remarked on her newfound steadiness. "Back to your old self, Miss Merrin," he said approvingly. But something else happened too, something she barely noticed. She paused often throughout the day, staring out the window at the drifting fog below. Her needle hovered mid-stitch as she let her gaze follow the silhouettes passing beneath the gas lamps. She wasn't daydreaming. Not exactly. It was more like slipping into a quiet place inside her mind, a place where time moved differently, where the world seemed muffled and distant. By the end of the week, these moments grew longer. By the end of the month, they consumed whole afternoons. Eliza would sit at the window, sewing forgotten in her lap, watching the street with a soft smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Her employer scolded her for late deliveries. She apologized with a gentleness that seemed almost otherworldly. At night, she took another sip, then a little more, then a little more again. The bottle's warmth had become the only time she felt truly herself, or at least the version of herself she preferred. Peaceful, floaty, unburdened. But the window became her anchor, her stage, her sanctuary. People below began to recognize the girl who watched them quietly from above, her face pale in the gaslight, her posture soft, her expression distant. Some whispered that she was sick, others said she had fallen in love. No one guessed that what held her so still, so entranced, was the gentle pull of the amber medicine, relaxing her grip on the world. Her stitching slowed, her deliveries faltered, her coin purse grew thin. But night after night, the girl at the window sat in her worn wooden chair, staring outward as if the fog itself were speaking to her, as if the drifting shapes below mattered more than the life slowly slipping from her grasp. Eliza Merrin was not lost, not yet, but the bottle was guiding her there. One quiet, fading evening at a time, Mayfair, dressed in its familiar elegance, seemed untouched by the struggles that weighed on the poorer districts of London. Its terraced townhouses glowed with soft lamplight, their polished windows reflecting the passing carriages, like mirrors of another, gentler world. Inside those homes, servants hurried quietly along carpeted halls, silverware gleamed on long mahogany tables, and candles flickered beneath crystal chandeliers. It was a world of order, refinement, and ritual, especially at dinner, where families gathered nightly beneath ceilings painted with angels and wreaths of plastered vines. But lately, the dinners in Mayfair had grown quieter, soft, muted, as though someone had wrapped the evenings in silk and pulled the edges tight. The Harwood family felt the change first. Sir Reginald Harwood had once been known for his booming laugh, a sound that carried from room to room like a declaration of triumph. His wife, Lady Isabella, was equally animated, her wit lively, her eyes bright, her dinner conversations the envy of every hostess on Grosvenor Square. But now, as the family gathered each evening at their long dining table, there was an unmistakable stillness in the room. It began subtly, a pause where laughter used to be, a softness in Lady Isabella's voice, a glaze to Sir Reginald's eyes when no one thought to look closely. But the children noticed most. 15-year-old Arthur watched his parents quietly, noting how his mother's hand trembled ever so slightly as she lifted her wine glass, how she smiled too long before responding to simple questions. His younger sister Clara whispered that Mama seemed tired. Arthur wasn't so sure. Their mother wasn't tired. She was floating, detached, distant, as though the golden chandelier above her was brighter than the world she now inhabited. Hidden in her dressing table drawer was the reason. Lady Isabella's physician had prescribed the little brown bottle for her occasional nerves, a delicate term for the anxiety that had grown in her chest since the previous winter. 1 spoonful each night, he had said. 2 if the tension was especially burdensome. She had followed the instructions faithfully at first, but then she found that the soft tranquility it offered made dinner conversations easier. It smoothed the rough edges of social obligations. It made arguments with her husband feel like distant memories. She wasn't alone. At dinner parties, Lady Isabella began noticing the same softened eyes staring back at her across candlelit tables. Women who once whispered sharply now murmured gently. Men who used to argue politics with passion now drifted through debates with lazy indifference. Servants moved with eerie quiet, aware that their masters were somehow different, slower, calmer, quieter than before. One evening, as soups were served and servants glided around the table like ghosts, Sir Reginald dropped his spoon. It clattered loudly against the china, startling everyone except him. He simply blinked at it, puzzled, as though unsure how it had fallen from his grasp. For a moment, the entire table froze. Then Lady Isabella smiled faintly. "He's simply tired," she said, touching his arm with unusual softness. The explanation went unquestioned, but the truth threaded itself through every room in the Harwood home. Servants whispered about the growing collection of amber bottles in the master's study. Clara noticed how her mother stared at her food without tasting it. Arthur discovered that his father had begun taking brief naps during the day, naps that left him groggy and irritable when he woke. By the end of the season, the Harwoods were not the only family dining in silence. Across Mayfair, elegant homes filled with polished silver and expensive wine hosted dinners where conversations floated like faint echoes and guests smiled with dreamy, vacant warmth. The medicine that had promised tranquility was quietly reshaping Mayfair's evenings into rituals of hushed voices and heavy-lidded eyes. The dinners were not lively anymore. They were serene, too serene, and beneath the glow of chandelier light, surrounded by fine china and velvet drapery, London's elite slowly faded behind their polite smiles, softened not by privilege, but by the same small brown bottle that had slipped quietly into every corner of the city. Mayfair's silence was not elegance, it was surrender. St. Bartholomew's Church stood at the edge of Bishopsgate like a weary guardian, its stone walls darkened by decades of soot, and its stained glass windows dulled by the city's endless breath. By day, the church bustled with the footsteps of parishioners seeking comfort, forgiveness, or simply a quiet place to rest from the noise of London. But at night, when the fog wrapped itself around the steeple and the bells hung silent in the tower, St. Bartholomew's belonged to only one man, Reverend Thomas Gray. He had been a devoted servant of God for nearly 20 years, a man whose sermons once stirred congregations to tears and whose voice carried through the nave with the steady assurance of a shepherd guiding his flock. But as the years passed, as London's burdens grew heavier and its troubles more complex, Thomas found that his heart grew heavier too. The confessions he heard, the poverty, the hunger, the grief, the illness, the quiet despair began to seep into him like damp into old stone. He prayed for strength, he prayed for clarity, but the prayers felt thinner every year. It was Mrs. Holling, the chemist's wife, who first placed the little brown bottle into his trembling hands. She had come seeking counsel after the sudden death of her sister, choking on tears as she confessed her guilt. Thomas comforted her as best he could, offering scripture and gentle words. When she left, she pressed the bottle into his palm. "For your sleep, Reverend," she whispered. "You look so tired." He told her he didn't need it, but that night, long after he had extinguished the lamps and paced between the pews whispering prayers that felt hollow, he pulled the cork from the bottle and allowed just a single spoonful to touch his tongue. The relief was immediate, a soft, warm unraveling of every knot inside him. He slept, truly slept, and that was how it began. Soon, the bottle became part of his nightly ritual. Before prayer, before scripture, before sleep, he took the dose that smoothed the edges of doubt and softened the sting of silence. The medicine quieted his mind so completely that he mistook its stillness for divine peace. But the change did not go unnoticed. Parishioners whispered that Reverend Gray's sermons had grown slow, gentle to the point of drifting. His voice no longer rang with conviction but floated through the chapel like smoke. His eyes, once bright with fervor, now glistened with an unfocused sheen when he spoke of salvation. Some evenings, as he prepared notes for Sunday service, his hand shook too strongly for him to continue writing. He blamed age, fatigue, anything but the truth. He found himself praying less, not because he didn't wish to, but because the bottle made prayer feel unnecessary. The moment it touched his tongue, a strange quiet washed over him, deeper and more comforting than any scripture had ever offered. And yet, when it wore off, doubt returned sharper than before. One night, as fog pressed itself against the stained glass like a pleading spirit, Thomas knelt before the altar, the little brown bottle in his pocket tapping softly against his robes. His hands trembled as he folded them. "Lord," he whispered, voice cracking in the stillness, "forgive me. I do not know whether this comfort comes from you or from what I take to find you." The only reply was the old church settling a wooden groan, a faint shift of air as if St. Bartholomew's itself withheld its judgment. When he rose, unsteady on his feet, He reached instinctively for the bottle again, not out of desire, but out of something deeper, need. In that moment, Reverend Thomas Gray understood the truth he had been avoiding. He was no longer whispering to God. He was whispering to the medicine, and the medicine whispered back. As winter tightened its grip on London, a strange pattern began to emerge, subtle at first, then steadily unmistakable. It was not marked on any chart, nor spoken aloud in council halls or printed in the morning papers. Yet it existed nonetheless, woven silently through the city's streets like an invisible thread. If someone could have drawn it onto a map, truly drawn it, they would have seen something chilling take shape, a spreading stain of amber-colored hunger touching every corner of the metropolis. But no one drew it. No one dared. They simply lived inside it. It started in the East End, where the bottle first slipped easily into the hands of mothers, dock workers, night laborers, and children weakened by the grind of living too close to the river's chill. From Whitechapel to Limehouse, from Rotherhithe to Shadwell, the remedy became a whispered staple, passed in stairwells, tucked inside aprons, traded for pennies or favors. If you walked through those districts at dusk, you would notice the same softened eyes, the same drifting steps, the same slurred relief in voices murmuring gratitude for a night without pain. Then the habit crept west. Clerkenwell's seamstresses, greengrocers, and machinists found comfort in it after days that left them sore and sleepless. Soho's actors and stagehands took it to soften the ache of performance or to calm the nerves that rattled backstage. Even Covent Garden's flower sellers, their fingers chapped from cold, kept the bottle hidden beneath their skirts to warm them through the long, bleak mornings. Further west still, in the grander streets of Bloomsbury and Marylebone, the bottle slipped into the hands of scholars, widows, governesses, and elderly men who struggled with aches their physicians could not cure. It moved quietly, refined in its presentation, tucked among bottles of tonic water or lavender soap. By the time it reached Mayfair and Belgravia, it had changed its manner. There, the medicine was recommended by private physicians, measured in proper teaspoons, and stored in locked cabinets behind porcelain vases. The wealthy used it as delicately as they used wine at first. Yet, even among chandeliers and velvet curtains, dependence followed. The city's elite drifted through their parlors in a haze that masqueraded as serenity, unaware or unwilling to admit how deeply the bottle had seeped into their lives. South of the river, in Lambeth and Southwark, factory workers relied on it to endure back-breaking shifts. Children carried small doses home for ill parents. Laborers took it with their supper to quiet the aches that never fully left their bones. Here, the reliance spread quickly, almost ruthlessly. The poor had no luxury of moderation. On paper, London remained the capital of an empire. In truth, it was becoming the capital of quiet dependency. If one could rise above the city, above the chimneys and spires, above the fog that clung to every brick, and look down at London with clear eyes, the map would be unmistakable. Thick clusters of dependence concentrated in the East End, narrow tendrils stretching westward along trade routes and carriage roads, soft circles of influence blooming around hospitals, churches, and chemist shops, fine threads weaving into wealthy districts, subtle but dense, and everywhere the faint glow of amber bottles sitting on mantelpieces, bedside tables, and kitchen shelves. It was a map not of disease or poverty, but of trust misplaced. The city did not realize it was tracing its own decay in invisible ink, but the pattern was there, growing stronger each week, connecting lives that would never meet, binding strangers through a single shared craving, and forming a network of reliance more intricate than any sewer or railway line. And somewhere, deep in the heart of London, the bottle waited on another counter, ready to mark another point on the map, another home, another life, another place where dependence would quietly take root, unnoticed, until it was far too late. The afternoon sun filtered through the high windows of Mrs. Langley's parlour, casting narrow beams of light that danced across the lace curtains and gleamed off the polished silver on the sideboard. tea had been poured, sandwiches arranged meticulously on porcelain plates, and the quiet murmur of polite conversation filled the room. The parlour-maid had left just moments before, leaving the ladies to their softened chatter and the faint aroma of Earl Grey, cinnamon, and the lingering sweetness of sugar cubes. But beneath the surface of civility, something trembled. It began small, almost imperceptibly. A slight quiver of the hand that held a teaspoon, a fleeting hesitation before reaching for the sugar tongs, a faint wobble in the cup as it was lifted to lips. To anyone else, it might have gone unnoticed, dismissed as fatigue or an overabundance of gesture. But Mrs. Langley, who had hosted countless gatherings in this room over 30 long years, felt the tremor with the precision of a woman who had memorized the weight of cups, the balance of plates, the rhythm of human habit. The tremor in the teacup belonged to Mrs. Pembroke. Her eyes, usually sharp and steady, softened as she lifted the small, brown bottle from her lap. She had hidden it beneath her skirts at the start of the visit, careful to remain unseen. The first sip had calmed her nerves, the second had smoothed the lines of anxiety in her shoulders, and now, in the hush of afternoon propriety, she felt the quiet urgency rising again. A small but insistent tug she could not ignore. Her hand shook as she tipped the cup to her lips. The liquid, amber and glimmering, seemed warmer than it had any right to be. She drank, letting the soothing effect unfurl slowly through her chest. A lightness followed, a soft detachment that made the polished room and its occupants blur slightly at the edges. Laughter, conversation, even the ticking of the mantel clock softened into the background. Relief settled into her, a subtle intoxication that both calmed and demanded. Across the room, Mrs. Langley noted the change immediately. The tremor, the subtle flush in Mrs. Pembroke's cheeks, the way her gaze lingered not on the others, but on the table, the cup, the amber liquid within it. Mrs. Langley said nothing. To speak would be to disturb the delicate equilibrium that had been achieved in this parlour, the soft balance of etiquette and appearance. Everyone here had come to rely on appearances, and Mrs. Langley understood that sometimes appearances were the only thing holding a room together. It was not just nerves that were soothed by the little brown bottle. It was doubt and fatigue and the persistent weight of expectation pressing on every shoulder. Each sip delivered a fleeting sense of mastery over a world that demanded constant grace, constant attention, constant composure. But it came at a cost. The tremor was a warning, a small sign that dependence had begun to creep into the carefully curated lives of Mayfair's women. It was a tremor that might have been dismissed were it not so persistent, so insistent, so impossibly human. By the time the tea was finished and the conversation drifted to gossip about the latest carriage accident or the sale of a neighbouring property, Mrs. Pembroke's hands steadied once more. She folded her napkin with the care of someone who had just performed a small miracle, hiding both the tremor and the knowledge of its cause. Yet the warmth in her chest lingered, subtle, insistent, whispering that she would need another sip soon, and soon again after that. The room was quiet once more, polite, serene, as though nothing had happened. But in the delicate vibration of a trembling hand, in the amber glow of a teacup, the truth lay hidden. Mayfair's women were slowly being claimed by the little brown bottle, and the tremor in the teacup was merely the first of many signs. The streets near Wapping were slick with the remnants of the river fog, the cobblestones glinting under the weak glow of gas lamps. Thomas Harding, a man whose back ached with years of dock labour, trudged along the narrow alley, his coat pulled tightly against the chill. He had earned every tremor in his hands, every stiffness in his joints, and every hollow groan that escaped him as he navigated the city's unforgiving streets. But tonight, he carried with him something heavier than exhaustion. A small brown bottle, its label curling slightly at the edges, promising relief in careful, elegant script. It had begun with necessity. His cough, once minor, had grown persistent and harsh, gnawing at his chest through long nights. The medicine eased the pain at first, a single teaspoon before bed, a measure so small it barely touched the day's weariness. Yet with each night, the warmth lingered a little longer, spreading through his limbs like liquid silk. The ache receded not only from his body, but from the very edges of his awareness, softening his world into a haze that felt too gentle to be real. By the second week, he found he needed more. A teaspoon at dusk was insufficient. He measured out a full dose before supper, then another just as night began to press against his window pane. The warmth that had once been comfort became a tether, binding him to the bottle with a subtle insistence he could not name. Each dose erased the ache, quieted the cough, and lifted the restless night from his chest. Yet it also demanded a quiet, unspoken allegiance. The more he drank, the more he realized he could not face the darkness alone. His fellow dockworkers noticed it first. Harding moved slower during the day, more carefully, eyes glinting with a peculiar detachment. He skipped meals, swallowed only when necessary, and avoided the rough play of apprentices in the warehouse. He carried the bottle not in his coat pocket, but clutched in his hand like a talisman, as though letting go would cause the entire city to collapse. Some whispered that he had taken to the drink, though this was neither ale nor brandy. Others thought him ill. No one guessed the truth. He had surrendered to something far quieter, far more intimate than the raucous clamor of the tavern. By the third week, the neighbors felt it. The low hum of his passage through the alley, the soft clink of glass against glass as he measured the amber liquid, the faint sigh that followed each swallow. These sounds crept under doors, into the night, unnoticed by most, but felt in the nervous tension of those who lived nearby. Harding had become part of the city's hidden rhythm, a silent note in the symphony of dependence spreading through London. Inside his small, drafty room, he lined up the bottles along the windowsill, counting them with the precision of a man whose life had become measured in drops. The warm light from the street lamps caught the glass, turning the amber liquid into molten gold. He drank again, and the ache vanished, as it always did. Yet the warmth now carried a whisper he could not ignore. 1 teaspoon was no longer enough. 2 would not suffice. Only more could keep the quiet still. Only more could make the night bearable. Outside, the fog pressed against the walls. Inside, Harding's pulse matched the rhythm of the city's quiet hunger. London had many secret vices, but none moved as softly, as persistently, as the little brown bottle that held the promise of relief and demanded far more in return. In a narrow room above a cobblestone alley, the fever returned like an old, cruel acquaintance. Margaret Hollis had believed herself cured, her body soothed by the amber liquid she had come to rely on night after night. The little brown bottle had promised relief, and it had delivered quiet, steady, almost magical in its effect. Her cough had eased, her shivering had ceased, and for several days she had wandered the streets with a measure of lightness she had thought long lost. But the body, stubborn as the city itself, would not remain obedient. It began with subtle tremors in her hands, barely noticeable at first. She blamed exhaustion, the lingering chill in the alleyways, the thin mattress beneath her. Then came the warmth in her chest, not the gentle warmth of comfort, but a burning insistence that chased through her veins, demanding attention. The cough returned, harsher than before, rattling through her ribcage with a voice sharper than any she had endured. Fevered flush rose to her cheeks, dampening her nightgown with sweat, leaving her shivering despite the heat that now gripped her. Margaret pressed herself against the cold plaster of the wall, eyes wide, listening to the city beyond her window. The fog moved like water through the alleys, muffling the sounds of carriage wheels, the occasional shout of a laborer, the distant bark of a dog. She could hear herself breathe, hear her heart pound against ribs already weak from weeks of sleepless nights. And somewhere in the bottom of her apron pocket, the little brown bottle waited silently, a promise she knew she would not resist. By the next evening, she had taken a spoonful, then another, and another, each drop chasing away the fever, but leaving a soft dependence in its wake. The warmth spread through her muscles, pulling the ache from her joints and the tremor from her hands, but leaving behind a quiet hunger she could not name. Each sip brought relief, yes, but also a subtle insistence that it was never enough, that she would need more tonight, more tomorrow, more always. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, aware of the growing tide of dependence that spread quietly through alleyways, workshops, and parlors alike. Neighbors began to notice. A child who had once clutched at her mother's skirts watched Margaret pass by with glassy eyes. The baker on the corner paused mid-step, noticing the faint tremor in her fingers as she adjusted her shawl. Even the night watchman, moving along the riverbanks, felt a shift in the rhythm of the streets, quieter, softer, heavier somehow, as though the city itself had inhaled and held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. In the small room, Margaret lay down, exhausted and fevered, feeling the amber liquid move through her bloodstream like slow, molten gold. Her eyelids fluttered, the ache in her chest softened, and for a moment she allowed herself the illusion of peace. But even as sleep claimed her, the fever whispered its return. It would not be long before she rose again, needing the bottle once more to quiet what the body insisted upon, remembering the pain, the weakness, the fragility that London demanded she endure. Relief was fleeting. Dependence was permanent. And beyond her walls, the city watched, silent and unknowing, as another soul was claimed quietly, invisibly, and utterly by the little brown bottle that had promised healing. The morning mist pressed against the windows of 17 Grosvenor Square like a cold, uninvited hand. Edward Langley, a gentleman of some regard in the city, sat propped in his high-backed chair, staring blankly at the polished parquet floor. Once a man of precise habits and sharp wit, he now found the simplest of motions, lifting a hand, adjusting a cufflink, rising from his chair impossible, without tremors that coursed like quiet lightning through his arms and legs. The amber remedy, once a novelty suggested by his physician to soothe restless nerves, had become a necessity that he could not resist. His wife, Lady Margaret, hovered nearby, concern etched into every careful line of her face. She had witnessed the slow transformation, the growing reliance, and the subtle haze that softened his once vivid gaze. "Edward," she whispered, adjusting the folds of his waistcoat, "must you remain here all morning? The day is bright, and there is business to attend." He tried to respond, to push against the lethargy that weighed his limbs, but words faltered, and his throat felt dry as though the air itself had thickened. The bottle rested on the side table within reach, a simple amber cylinder that had quietly rewritten the rhythm of their mornings. 1 teaspoon had promised relief, but it now demanded allegiance, a gentle coercion that left him both comforted and captive. The fog outside mirrored the cloud in his mind. He could recall the mornings before the remedy, the crispness of the air, the clarity of thought that had accompanied every step. Now, clarity was a distant memory, blurred by the soft warmth that flowed through him whenever he drank. It made him feel weightless, soothed the pulse of exhaustion, yet left an emptiness that clawed beneath the surface, a hunger that could not be sated by mere comfort. His valet, an elderly man named Thomas who had served the Langleys for decades, approached cautiously, noting the glassy sheen in his employer's eyes and the slight quiver that ran from shoulder to wrist. "Shall I prepare your tea, sir?" he asked softly, careful not to startle him. Edward nodded slightly, grateful for the attention yet aware of the growing dependence that lurked behind the gesture. When the cup was poured and the teaspoon dipped into the amber liquid, he felt the familiar warmth unfurl, threading through tired muscles, easing aches that were as much mental as physical. For a moment, he was free, weightless, peaceful, as though the room had shrunk and cradled him entirely. But freedom was fleeting. The relief quickly reminded him of what he had surrendered. Rising from the chair was no longer a simple action. Each attempt left him breathless, each movement hesitant. He drank again, not out of desire, but because the day pressed upon him with a relentless inevitability he could no longer face sober. Outside, The city hummed with its usual rhythms, carts rattled along cobblestones, merchants shouted their wares, and the fog rolled through narrow alleys. Inside the home, Edward Langley remained tethered to the amber liquid that promised ease and exacted dependence. His strength was not gone, it was merely borrowed, lent temporarily by the small brown bottle that had crept into every corner of his life, quietly demanding more than he had ever intended to give. By late afternoon, whispers had begun to move through the alleys and parlours of London like smoke carried on the wind. In coffee houses and cobblestoned streets, in curtained windows and along the riverbanks, murmurs passed quietly from mouth to ear. Some spoke of sleepless nights softened too easily, others of trembling hands and drifting eyes, and a few, braver or perhaps more fearful, spoke in the most daring of tones that the little brown bottles might be dangerous. Poison, they said, silent, slow, and invisible, creeping beneath the skin, softening minds as effectively as it dulled pain. In the cramped room above the apothecary on Fleet Street, Mrs. Hollis had heard it first from a neighbour who had paused in the alley to gossip. They say it isn't just laudanum anymore. Something stronger, something deadly. She had pressed her hands to her chest, the words catching in her throat. She had trusted the bottles for months, believing in their promises, clinging to the warmth that unfurled with each measured spoonful. But now, the very thought that it might harm her, or worse, the children had crept into her mind like a shadow she could not shake. Across the city, in a townhouse in Bloomsbury, the ladies at the afternoon gathering stiffened when one mentioned the rumour. The amber bottles sat discreetly on side tables, their presence a quiet comfort to those who relied on them. Lady Pembroke's fingers twitched slightly as she lifted her cup, the warmth from her own spoonful still lingering in her veins. The notion that her trusted remedy might carry unseen consequences sent a ripple of unease through the room. Conversation slowed, laughter became tentative, and eyes darted to the glassy liquid, as if it could answer the questions that no one dared speak aloud. Even the clergy, who had observed their parishioners with careful attention, began to notice patterns that spoke louder than words. Reverend Gray, pacing the aisle of St. Bartholomew's, counted the tremors, the hollowed cheeks, the restless eyes during confession. The medicine that had promised peace had brought instead a subtle dependence, and now the rumour of poison seemed almost tangible, an unspoken acknowledgement of the truth that even faith could not mask. On the riverbanks, dockworkers paused in the misty twilight to exchange news of colleagues who had fallen ill, who slept too long, who walked like strangers through the fog. Their whispers spread further than the fog itself could reach. Each story seemed to carry weight, a confirmation of fear in a city already on edge. The streets themselves felt heavier, as though absorbing the anxiety, pressing it into the brick and stone that lined the alleys. By evening, the rumour had settled over the city like a fog thicker than the one that rolled off the Thames. The apothecaries counted their bottles with a new caution. Families questioned the nightly dose. Eyes once trusting and serene now lingered on the way, amber liquid, with suspicion, uncertainty curling beneath the lids. London had learned something fundamental. Relief carried a price, and the small brown bottles heralded as salvation had always held the shadow of danger within. The whispers became part of the city's pulse, threading through homes, parlours, and tenements alike, weaving a quiet tension that settled in the chest of every dependent soul. Fear did not erupt into chaos. It moved softly, unnoticed by many, acknowledged by few, but it marked the beginning of awareness, the first step toward understanding that the warmth which had soothed so many also concealed the creeping, quiet hazard of the little brown bottle. Outside the iron gates of St. Mary's Infirmary, the night pressed thick against the cobblestones, carrying with it the scent of coal smoke, damp earth, and the faint metallic tang of the river. Figures huddled near the archway, their breath forming ghosts in the cold air, hands trembling, eyes hollow. They had come seeking something no doctor could give them, no prayer could reach them, no rest of the city could afford. They came for the little brown bottles, the amber promise of ease, of warmth, of escape. The gatekeeper, an old man with eyes sunken from years of watching the same scene repeat night after night, leaned on his staff and shook his head. He knew most of these faces, men and women who had once worked the docks, swept the streets, or labored in shops, now shuffled toward him with the same quiet desperation in their steps. Each carried a small cloth bundle or a pocketful of coins, their voices low and urgent when they spoke to one another. They did not cry, they did not shout, they whispered, like shadows passing through the fog. Among them was Robert Finch, a former clerk whose hands had grown shaky with too many nights of hard work and too many sips from the amber bottles. He had lost track of how many days had passed since he first entered the chemist's shop for relief. It had begun innocently, a teaspoon to calm his nerves, a drop to quiet a headache, a measure to soothe the cold that gnawed through his ribs. Each dose had promised peace. Each dose demanded more. He was not alone. The courtyard around the hospital gate filled with men and women, young and old, all carrying the same fragile hope in a small bottle. They waited patiently, moving their feet in soft rhythms to ward off the chill, their eyes flicking toward the shuttered windows, imagining the warmth inside. The infirmary had long been a place of healing, but now it seemed to serve another purpose entirely, as a beacon, a silent signal to those who suffered too deeply, too quietly, to resist the amber lure. A nurse glanced out from a side window, her face pale in the dim candlelight. She recognized some of them, former patients, neighbors, distant relatives. Her heart twisted with quiet dread. The medicine they sought was the same one she had administered under careful supervision within the hospital walls. She knew it soothed the pain, quieted the coughs, eased the trembling, but she also knew the truth that few dared acknowledge. It bound the soul as surely as it calmed the body. A soft wind rustled through the gates, carrying the faint creak of wood and iron, and the figures shifted closer, whispering to one another with voices barely audible. Each step toward the entrance was both hesitant and insistent. Each bottle represented relief earned and freedom borrowed. Every soul waiting in the fog understood that the warmth of the medicine came at a cost, though most would not name it aloud. By midnight, the gate was a tapestry of longing, shadowed faces, and quivering hands. The hospital itself seemed to hum in recognition, the walls absorbing the energy of those gathered, the windows reflecting the flicker of candlelight against anxious eyes. London's streets were quiet beyond the walls, but here, at the threshold of relief, the city's dependents gathered in a hushed, persistent tide, patient, obedient, and quietly unstoppable. The amber glow waited within, promising peace, and the waiting souls, weary and desperate, were ready to pay its price. The corridors of St. Bartholomew's had grown unnervingly silent by the late afternoon, the usual clatter of boots and whispered instructions replaced by a stillness that pressed against the walls like fog. Inside, the doctors moved with a mechanical precision, their faces impassive, their hands steady. Yet beneath their composed exterior, a quiet unease simmered. They had begun to notice patterns too troubling to ignore. Patients who arrived with fevers had grown dependent on the amber remedy. Nurses who administered it displayed tremors of their own, and even gentlemen of Mayfair returned nightly to the same bottle, glassy-eyed and soft-limbed. Dr. Alistair Whitcomb was the first to speak, his voice low and hesitant in the meeting room of the medical staff. "We cannot ignore it," he said, tapping a ledger filled with notes and observations. "The remedy works, yes, but it has begun to claim more than illness. It claims the very will of those who take it." His colleagues shifted uneasily in their chairs. Some nodded, others looked away, unwilling to confront the implication. It was not malice that caused them to turn away, but fear of public scandal, of professional ruin, and of the moral weight that might fall upon them should they interfere. They had taken an oath to heal, yet the very thing they had prescribed in the name of relief was slowly consuming the patients, the nurses, and even themselves. The little brown bottle, carefully measured and elegantly labeled, had become a tool of quiet domination over the city's population. In one ward, Sister Evelyn Marsh noted the subtle decline in her patients, the way their coughs softened too quickly, the way their eyes no longer reflected pain but a strange, detached serenity. She had administered the remedy countless times, yet now she questioned each dose, wondering if the relief she provided was masking dependence. Even she felt the pull of the amber warmth in her own veins at night, a reminder that the line between healer and victim was thinner than she wished to admit. The doctor's offices filled with hushed consultations and reluctant conversations. One physician murmured, "Perhaps it is better left to its course. They believe it cures, after all." Another added, "Intervention might create panic. People are already fragile enough." Rationalizations built a protective wall, shielding them from acknowledging their complicity. They recorded progress charts, examined vitals, and suggested more conventional treatments to family members, all while allowing the bottle to circulate unchecked. Outside, London's fog thickened, curling around the lamplit streets, swallowing sounds of distant footfalls, carriage wheels, and whispered anxieties. The city moved unaware of the growing tide within its own homes, boarding houses, and hospital wards. Families trusted the remedy, believing in the authority of the men in white coats, never suspecting that those same men had begun to avert their eyes, silently condoning the dependence that spread like smoke through alleys and parlors alike. By evening, the wards were quiet once more. Patients slept too deeply, nurses moved with measured steps, and the doctors, exhausted and conflicted, retired to their offices, their hands trembling slightly as they scribbled notes they would never share aloud. London had become a city of muted reliance, a network of silent sufferers and cautious observers, and in the back of every mind, a single, unspoken truth lingered. The amber liquid could no longer be trusted, yet no one dared confront it directly. The news spread through London like a sudden chill, carried in whispers along foggy streets and through the parlors of the city's wealthiest quarters. The little brown bottle, once celebrated for its ability to soothe coughs, calm nerves, and grant the elusive comfort of sleep, had been deemed too dangerous to remain in circulation. A royal edict, bolstered by medical testimony, declared its contents a public hazard, and chemists were instructed to remove it from their shelves immediately. In the East End, dock workers paused mid-step as the news reached them. A man who had carried crates for decades leaned against a wall, staring at the mist rising from the Thames and gripping the empty pocket where his bottle once rested. The remedy had been his anchor through long nights, softening the aches in his limbs and quieting the persistent cough that no physician could fully heal. Now it was gone, confiscated, banned by an authority he neither trusted nor fully understood. In Mayfair, the reaction was quieter, but no less profound. Lady Pembroke held the empty vial in her gloved hand, the amber liquid gone, replaced by a hollow sense of unease. Her eyes, once softened by the gentle haze of relief, now looked sharp and unguarded, scanning the familiar parlor for comfort that was no longer there. Even her servants noticed the subtle tremors in her fingers, the way she clutched the silver spoon a little too tightly, her body adjusting to the sudden absence of the drug that had lulled her evenings into silence. Hospitals felt the change immediately. Nurses and doctors had grown reliant on the medicine for themselves and for their patients. Sister Evelyn Marsh moved through the wards, her steps careful and deliberate, noting the coughs that returned with a harshness once dulled by the amber remedy. Patients stirred more often, bodies tense with discomfort, and the quiet calm that had pervaded the hospital for months dissipated like smoke from a snuffed candle. Doctors whispered among themselves, acknowledging the necessity of the ban, while grappling with the practical consequences of withdrawal among those who had grown dependent. Street corners and alleyways filled with anxious citizens seeking alternatives, improvising with other tonics, stronger teas, or simple warm water. The city itself seemed to exhale a collective shiver as it adjusted to the sudden removal of what had become a silent companion to the weary, the ill, and the restless. Families who had long relied on the bottle to ease children's fevers or calm the nerves of anxious wives found themselves staring into the amber emptiness left behind. Some wept quietly, others simply held their heads in their hands, realizing the extent to which they had surrendered their evenings, their sleep, and their very sense of peace to a liquid now outlawed. By nightfall, London was quieter than it had been in months, but not with the gentle calm the bottle had once provided. The streets carried a tension, a restless energy born of absence, as if the fog itself was unsettled. Families gathered around dim fireplaces, whispering about the remedy, about what they had lost, and about how the city had become a little less forgiving without its amber solace. The ban had been enforced, the law clear, yet the emptiness it left behind was a stark reminder. The little brown bottle had offered more than relief, it had claimed lives in subtle, unnoticeable ways, and the city now had to learn to breathe without it. The morning light fell unevenly across London, piercing the lingering fog with narrow shafts of grey and gold. For weeks, months even, the city had moved in a quiet haze, as if caught in a collective half-sleep, each resident softened by the amber comfort of the little brown bottles. Mothers had rested, dock workers had wandered through their tasks with muted steps, and gentlemen of the squares had drifted through parlours with glassy eyes, all lulled by the warmth of the remedy. But now, with the bottles gone, the streets themselves seemed to stir, shaking off the long, dreamlike hold the medicine had exerted over the populace. The awakening began slowly. Shopkeepers raised shutters earlier than usual, blinking against the sun's intrusion as though it had caught them by surprise. Children emerged from tenements, rubbing eyes swollen from fevered nights, their small hands clutched around blankets instead of a bottle's promise. Dock workers tramped to the river with heavier steps, the chill biting through their coats, their coughs returning with a sharp, persistent edge that reminded them of the life they had almost forgotten. The fog rolled in patches, less forgiving now, exposing the city's irregular cobbles and grime to the first light of day. In the East End, a mother stirred in her narrow room, startled awake by the return of her child's restless coughing. She had depended on the amber liquid for comfort, the nightly relief that had softened the edges of long, bitter winters. Now, with the remedy banned, the room seemed colder, the night longer, and the responsibilities she had temporarily ignored came crashing back with cruel intensity. She dressed quickly, her hands trembling as she carried the child downstairs, the absence of the small brown bottle a gnawing presence in every step. Meanwhile, in Mayfair, the awakening was subtler, but no less profound. Lady Pembroke's servants noticed her hands tremble as she poured tea, her movements precise but tense. The parlour that had once resonated with soft laughter and polite conversation now felt brittle, fragile, alive with unspoken frustration. Gentlemen adjusted waistcoats, blinking rapidly as their thoughts cleared, and the dull haze of the last months faded. The absence of the medicine exposed the vulnerability beneath the refined exterior, and the streets outside mirrored this subtle chaos, with more animated chatter, carriage wheels clattering sharply, and the occasional exclamation cutting through the crisp morning air. Even in the hospital wards, the awakening was palpable. Nurses moved briskly, attending to patients whose coughs returned with sudden vigor. Doctors scrawled notes, consulting charts more intently, recognizing that dependence had left both body and mind weakened. Evelyn Marsh, overseeing a row of recovering patients, noted the tremor in her own hands as she administered care without the comfort of the familiar remedy. The warmth it had provided, the illusion of ease, was gone. Only the stark, unmediated reality of illness remained. By midday, the city had fully stirred from its dreamlike slumber. Streets filled with pedestrians, voices carried with clarity, and the hum of commerce returned to its full cadence. London had awakened, suddenly aware of the absence that had been hiding in plain sight, feeling the gaps left by months of reliance on a small brown bottle. The city moved with tension and awareness, as if testing its strength, and in every alley, every parlour, every warehouse, one truth resonated quietly. The dream had ended, and the waking world, harsh and unyielding, demanded attention. The final amber vial sat quietly in the drawer, nestled among receipts, letters, and the faint scent of mothballs. Its presence was understated, almost humble, yet it carried the weight of months, years, even of reliance, comfort, and silent surrender. For those who had depended on it, the little brown bottle had been more than medicine. It had been a companion, a balm for sleepless nights, a softening of the relentless ache that haunted London's streets and homes. Now, as the decree of prohibition echoed through the city, this last remnant seemed almost impossibly precious, the final repository of relief in a world suddenly stripped of its easy balm. Margaret Hollis, whose cough had haunted her for weeks, paused as she opened the drawer. The sight of the amber liquid, glinting faintly in the light that seeped through the cracked shutters, made her hands tremble. She could almost hear the echo of her own nightly rituals, the careful measure poured, the warm taste on her tongue, the instant wash of quiet warmth through every bone. The remedy had soothed her, given her rest, and allowed her to endure the relentless weight of days that dragged through cold alleys and crowded tenements. Now, with the city aware of the danger and the ban enforced, this single vial represented the last tether to a comfort she had long taken for granted. Across town, in a parlour softened by curtains and polished wood, Lady Pembroke regarded her own last bottle with a quiet, almost reverent gaze. The glow of gaslight caught the amber liquid and made it shimmer like captured sunlight. She had hidden it carefully beneath lace and silk, a secret promise against the encroaching absence. Her hands hovered above it for a moment longer than necessary, and in that pause, the weight of dependence pressed upon her. Relief had come easily, yet without it, she felt the edges of the world sharpen uncomfortably against her skin. The city outside continued its rigid rhythms, indifferent to the quiet desperation of those left holding the last drops. In the hospital wards, nurses glanced at the remaining bottles with the same mixture of reverence and fear. Evelyn Marsh set one carefully on the bedside table, aware that the healing effect it had provided was inseparable from the silent hold it exerted. Patients slept, nurses moved with measured steps, and even the doctors hesitated, knowing the final vial would soon vanish, leaving a vacuum of quiet that would reveal both the physical and psychological dependency the remedy had fostered. The ward seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable moment when absence would replace the comfort that had become so integral to the rhythm of care. Even outside the confines of home and hospital, the last bottles were treasures. Dock workers, shopkeepers, and labourers who had glimpsed the remedy in passing understood the significance of possession, of the delicate balance between relief and withdrawal. The amber glow of glass held a subtle authority, a silent reminder of the city's reliance and its fragile equilibrium. When the final doses were administered, measured carefully and reluctantly, London exhaled in unison, an entire city aware, for the first time, of what had been lost. The streets remained bustling, the fog rolled over the river, and life continued as it always had. But the absence of the little brown bottle marked a profound change. It was not just medicine that had been removed. It was the illusion of effortless reprieve, the quiet lull of relief that had shaped the city's nights and softened its days. And in every home, in every parlour, in every hospital, the last bottle in the drawer became a symbol, the end of comfort, the beginning of awareness, and the stark reminder that relief, once taken too freely, exacts its own inexorable price. London stirred under the morning fog with a cautious, uneven breath, as if the entire city were just beginning to wake from a long, fevered dream. The little brown bottles that had once rested on mantelpieces, counters, and bedside tables were gone, removed by decree, swept from the streets and homes with the precision of authority, and yet their absence did not erase the traces they had left behind. The city now carried the subtle weight of dependence, the lingering echoes of comfort taken too freely, and the faint, persistent tremor of lessons learned far too late. In the East End, Families stirred from restless nights, blinking through haze-thickened sunlight. Children coughed in rhythm with the returning cold, and mothers rubbed their hands across aching limbs, feeling the rawness that the medicine had previously softened. The narrow streets, once smoothed by the quiet rhythm of amber reliance, now carried the jangle of impatience, the rustle of exhaustion, the sharp breath of those unprepared for the sudden return of discomfort. Men whose labor had been dulled by the remedy lifted crates with strained effort, their muscles rebelling, their lungs reminding them of every day they had spent softened by a temporary balm. Mayfair's streets were quieter in a different way, weighted with tension and subtle alarm. Gentlemen who had relied on the bottle to steady their thoughts stumbled slightly over long-held manners, their steps measured against unfamiliar fatigue. Women in parlors, previously gliding through evenings in a soft haze, now carried a faint tremor in their hands, and the invisible weight of nights bent awake. Even the servants noticed the change was subtle, but insistent, a shift in rhythm, a slackening of the once polite composure that had dominated households for months. London had been taught that relief came easily. Now it was learning the hard way that absence revealed vulnerability in stark relief. Hospitals and infirmaries felt the transformation acutely. Nurses moved briskly, attending to patients whose conditions seemed sharper, whose aches and coughs returned with uncompromising clarity. Doctors recorded vitals with renewed attention, noticing the subtle dependence that had spread through their wards. Evelyn Marsh, observing the ebb and flow of recoveries and withdrawals, felt a chill awareness settle into her chest. The city had traded ease for resilience, and the cost of the little brown bottle had not been lost on those who had spent nights administering it and living alongside it. The market squares, the alleyways, the quiet lanes threading through tenements and townhouses alike, all carried the lesson. London could no longer pretend that comfort came without price. It was written in the slackened steps of laborers, the tremor of aristocratic hands, the restless eyes of children, the subtle fatigue in caregivers, and while life continued, moving with its usual chaos, each resident felt the imprint of the attester, remedy that had once promised ease but delivered dependence. By evening, the fog rolled in once more, thick and unrelenting, wrapping the city in the familiar grey embrace. But London had changed. The streets had learned that comfort taken too easily is never free. The parlours, the docks, the hospitals, all bore witness to the subtle transformation, and as lamps glimmered against the mist, casting their soft reflections on damp stones, the city exhaled a collective understanding. It had been softened, lulled, and claimed, and now it must navigate a world stripped of the little brown bottle's deceptive grace. London breathed differently now. The little brown bottles were gone, swept from counters, parlours, and tenements, leaving behind a city suddenly raw, exposed, and acutely aware of the night softened by their amber glow. Streets that had once carried a quiet, dreamlike rhythm now moved with tension, a subtle vigilance in every step and gesture. Mothers, fathers, labourers, and merchants alike felt the absence in their bones, in their breath, and in the hollow spaces where comfort had once settled too easily. In Whitechapel, the alleys were crowded with children who no longer slept through the night, their coughs sharp against the damp air. Mothers pressed thin blankets to chests still warm from fever, eyes scanning shadows for the unseen menace that had been comfort and cruelty in equal measure. They remembered the nights when a teaspoon of amber liquid had brought silence, warmth, and fleeting peace. Now, memory carried a weight heavier than the absence itself, a reminder of the reliance that had grown unnoticed, of the tenderness and the danger wrapped together in a single vial. Even in the grander streets of Bloomsbury, where well-dressed gentlemen and ladies of refinement had once drifted through parlours in soft, glassy-eyed calm, the absence was keenly felt. Conversations sharpened, laughter grew brittle, and the polite smiles that had masked quiet dependency faded. Lady Pembroke adjusted her gloves nervously, noting how her own hands shook slightly when she poured tea. The city's wealth had once made comfort a matter of choice. Now it made the consequences unavoidable. In hospitals and infirmaries, the lessons were graver. Nurses, who had depended on the amber liquid as much as their patients, now moved with measured caution, noting returning tremors and the subtle ache of withdrawal. Doctors observed with a mixture of awe and alarm charts recorded progress, but also dependence, a soft undercurrent that had been hidden beneath relief. Evelyn Marsh walked the corridors with careful steps, feeling the hollowed eyes of patients and staff alike, understanding that the city had absorbed the lesson even before it could speak it aloud. Comfort once taken too freely exacts a quiet, enduring toll. By dusk, the fog rolled over the Thames and into every street, softening the sharp lines of brick and cobblestone, the rigid angles of rooftops and chimneys. It carried with it the echoes of the city's collective memory, the nights of warmth, the softened aches, the trembling hands, the glassy eyes. London could not forget. It had learned the weight of dependency, the subtle claim of relief that came too easily and lingered too long. The past, once washed away by the haze of comfort, now pressed against the present like a spectre no household could ignore. As lamps flickered against mist, the city exhaled a slow, cautious, collective breath, carrying the knowledge that comfort had its price, that even a small brown bottle could shape a metropolis. And while life resumed its usual patterns, merchants haggled, children ran, coaches clattered, London was forever marked by what it had trusted too readily, what it had embraced too gently, and what it would now carry, quietly, into every dawn. The morning fog had begun to lift, revealing the city in stark clarity for the first time in months. London, once softened by the pervasive influence of the little brown bottles, now faced itself fully awake. Every cobblestone, every alley, every narrow thoroughfare seemed sharper, harder, as though the city itself had grown used to the absence of the amber remedy and the quiet dependence it fostered. Memories of relief clung to the bricks like stubborn ivy, and the streets themselves seemed to recall the nights of softened sighs, muted footsteps, and drifting figures that had once moved as if in a shared, subdued dream. In Whitechapel, the tenements echoed with returning unrest. Children coughed and wheezed in their cramped rooms, parents' hands shaking as they tended to aching limbs and fevered brows. Families had relied for months on the subtle warmth of the medicine, a temporary reprieve that had made each night bearable. Now, with the bottles removed, the city's hum returned to its natural rhythm, harsher, less forgiving, and unforgiving in its insistence on alertness and attention. Residents adjusted, stumbling at first, uncertain how to navigate a world unsoftened by artificial warmth. In Mayfair and Bloomsbury, the awakening was quieter but no less profound. Gentlemen who had once drifted through parlours and drawing rooms in the subdued haze of the amber liquid now found their thoughts sharper, their hands more restless. Ladies whose evenings had been lulled into soft, compliant calm now adjusted their postures, their hands curling tightly around the teacups and silver spoons, feeling the absence of relief like a tangible weight. Conversations, once measured and polite, gained an edge, a subtle tension that the city had not felt for months. The streets outside mirrored the change. Steps grew quicker, voices sharper, the clatter of carriages and carts more abrupt. Hospitals and infirmaries reflected the city's shift in ways more immediate and striking. Nurses moved briskly, adjusting to the resurgence of aches, fevers, and tremors that had been previously subdued. Patients stirred from long, drugged slumbers with sudden sharpness, coughing and clutching at bedsheets in a manner that reminded staff of the frailty of their condition. Doctors, now forced to contend with the withdrawal and returning discomfort, moved among the wards with renewed vigilance, observing the subtle reclaiming of strength that came with the absence of the amber liquid. Evelyn Marsh noted each tremor, each flush, each hesitant step, recording them in a ledger that had become less about cure and more about the careful mapping of human endurance. The city outside, cleansed of the soft haze that had dulled senses and eased pain, carried the memory of those nights. Streets remembered the figures who had wandered through the fog, their steps gentle, their eyes unfocused, their hands trembling with quiet dependence. Alleyways retained the echo of whispered conversations, of secret exchanges, and of soft sighs that had travelled unnoticed through doors and windows. London, now fully awake, had been shaped irrevocably by the experience, carrying the imprint of the little brown bottles long after they had vanished from sight. The fog that lingered over the Thames swirled in the streets, diffusing the sounds of the city, but it could not erase what had been. Every step along the polished stones, every conversation in the market, every cough in the tenement, all bore witness to a city that had been softened, lulled, and ultimately awakened. London remembered, and it had learned painfully, irrevocably, the true cost of the quiet comfort it had once taken too readily. In the drawing rooms of Mayfair, the gas lamps cast a warm, golden glow over polished floors and gilded furniture, but the light could not reach the hollowness that had settled into the eyes of the city's elite. Months of reliance on the little brown bottles had left subtle, indelible marks. Eyelids drooped slightly, fingers trembled just enough to betray the quiet dependency, and conversations carried a soft, dreamlike edge that no longer reflected the sharpness of mind or wit once expected. Behind every polite smile, there was a fatigue that no tea, no carriage ride, and no servant's attentions could fully erase. Lady Pembroke sat at her satin-covered parlour table, tracing the rim of her teacup absent-mindedly. The amber liquid she had once relied upon now absent, she felt the weight of night softened by its warmth pressing back against her, demanding acknowledgement. She recalled evenings when she had moved gracefully through parlours, gliding from conversation to conversation, the slight tremor in her hands masked by gloves and etiquette. Now, without the remedy, the tremor remained visible in the subtle quiver of her wrist as she lifted the cup to her lips. Even her breathing carried the faint, uneven cadence of nights spent in dependence. Across the room, gentlemen who had once held the bottle with casual familiarity now leaned into chairs with a careful deliberation, their fingers lingering over the armrests as if seeking a grounding force that no longer existed. Their eyes, once bright and calculating, now carried a glassy, almost unseeing quality, reflecting the emptiness that the amber comfort had once masked. Conversations were measured, their tones softened, words chosen with deliberate care to mask fatigue and unease. Politeness remained, but the vitality had been leached, leaving a hollow veneer of civility. Even the servants sensed the change. Footfalls were quieter, the rustle of skirts slower and more hesitant, as if the subtle shifts in their employer's behavior had infected the rhythm of the household. Silverware clinked with a softer edge, tea was poured more deliberately, and the parlour itself seemed to settle into a subdued, almost anticipatory tension. Everyone knew the nights had been easier once, yet no one fully acknowledged what had been lost. The little brown bottles, carefully measured and discreetly administered, had granted calm, while silently extracting a toll, leaving behind subtle tremors, soft gazes, and hollow eyes that betrayed the reality of dependence. Outside, Mayfair's streets mirrored the interior stillness. Carriages moved along the polished stones with an uncharacteristic hesitation, and pedestrians walked with a quiet deliberation, almost as though the city itself had inherited the weight of the remedy's absence. Windows reflected tired eyes, both of the wealthy and of the servants who glimpsed them briefly, and the fog drifting in from the Thames carried the faint hum of awareness that something within the city had changed irrevocably. By dusk, the parlour lamps burned low, and Lady Pembroke leaned back in her chair, fingertips brushing the edge of the table. She could no longer rely on the amber warmth to soften the edges of the night, to calm nerves, or to lend grace to her movements. In its absence, she saw clearly what had been disguised for months: the subtle cost of comfort, the quiet erosion of vitality, and the hollow eyes that stared back at her in every mirror, every polished surface, and every reflective glance. Mayfair had been softened. Now it had been revealed. In a narrow, soot-streaked alley near Cheapside, the shop of Mr. Henry Alcott had long been a quiet place of trade, where bolts of cloth, rolls of ribbon, and measured yards of lace moved under the careful eye of a man whose reputation for precision was known across the district. Yet behind the polished counters and neatly arranged displays lay a secret few suspected a reliance on the little brown bottles that had crept into the rhythms of his daily life and softened the relentless grind of commerce. Henry had first been introduced to the remedy during a particularly bitter winter, when the chill of the river fog and the constant strain of labor in his shop had left his muscles stiff, his wrists aching, and his mind weary. The chemist's advice had been simple: a teaspoon before bed, just enough to ease the tension, to allow rest. The effect had been immediate warmth spreading through his arms, a lightness in his chest, and the rare, welcome relief of unbroken sleep. He had returned to work the following morning with a steadiness that drew the attention of colleagues and customers alike, as if he had discovered some secret advantage over the toil that threatened to consume him. At first, Henry's use was measured, careful, and secret. He took only what was necessary to maintain functionality, preserving the veneer of self-discipline that had defined him. Yet over time, necessity gave way to habit, and habit to quiet dependence. The warm relief that once softened the ache of labor now drew him back with subtle insistence. A long day at the shop, the constant lifting and measuring, the endless negotiations all demanded the comfort of a sip, a teaspoon, a moment of warmth that promised escape. The effect on his interactions was almost imperceptible at first. His hands trembled slightly as he measured cloth, his voice softened when speaking to customers, and his once sharp gaze occasionally lingered on the amber liquid at the back of the counter. By evening, when the shop had emptied and the gas lamps cast elongated shadows across the floor, he would pour another measure for himself, just to maintain the calm that had become essential. Henry's secret was mirrored in subtle ways across the city. Merchants, clerks, and laborers alike had embraced the remedy as a quiet aid, an invisible companion that allowed them to endure hours of toil, stress, and exhaustion. Yet the same warmth that comforted also bound, and the dependence that grew quietly within homes and shops alike began to shape the city's rhythms. Streets softened, steps slowed, and hands that had once been quick with precision now trembled under the faintest pressure, revealing the hidden cost of ease. By midnight, Henry sat alone in the quiet of his shop, the last bottle carefully corked and set aside. The amber liquid glimmered in the gaslight, a deceptive promise of comfort and calm. He knew the city had changed, subtly but irrevocably, and that his own reliance had left marks that would linger far longer than the warmth in his chest. The little brown bottles had offered relief, but at the price of subtle surrender, and in the silence of the shop, Henry felt the full weight of that realization pressing down, heavier than any bolt of cloth he had ever lifted. By the dim lamplight of the evening, London's narrow alleys and crowded tenements carried more than the usual fog and soot. They carried murmurs, whispered in tones too soft to be heard beyond the ear of a neighbor. The little brown bottles, once a source of quiet relief, had begun to stir conversation in hushed corners, passing from lips to ears, like shadows flitting across the cobblestones. Mothers, merchants, clerks, and seamstresses alike exchanged cautious words about tremors, faded eyes, and the subtle changes they had observed in friends and family. Mrs. Hollis, leaning out of her top-floor window, heard the whispers first. A neighbor across the lane spoke of a child who slept too long, of hands that trembled even after the cough had vanished, and of the strange detachment that followed every sip of the amber liquid. The words, soft and urgent, traveled through the thin walls of her apartment, echoing against the plaster like faint bells. She pressed a hand to her chest, her mind racing with questions she had long avoided. For months, the remedy had been her ally, easing pain and offering the promise of uninterrupted sleep. Now it was a source of fear. In the parlors of Mayfair, the whispers carried a different weight. Ladies who had relied on the little brown bottles for composure for calmness during long evenings of conversation, now exchanged subtle glances as the rumors reached them, the tremors in their fingers, the glassy look in their eyes, and the strange fatigue that clung to them had been dismissed for months as the natural toll of life in the city. But now, framed in the language of caution and warning, those small signs became a source of unease. Tea was poured more carefully, glances were exchanged more knowingly, and the polished silences of drawing rooms carried the tension of a secret being slowly revealed. Even the clergy noticed. Reverend Gray, walking through the pews of St. Bartholomew's in the late twilight, overheard confessions tinged with more than guilt, murmurs about tremors, about dependency, about warmth that lingered too long. The little brown bottle, once treated as a benign elixir, had become something more dangerous in the minds of the people, a subtle agent of change, of dependency, and of quiet surrender. Gray paused in the aisle, listening to the soft confessions of his parishioners, noting the tremors in their voices, and wondered how long it would take for the city to understand what was quietly spreading through it. By midnight, the rumors had coalesced into a silent knowledge. Alleyways, tenements, and even the polished streets of the West End hummed with cautious awareness. The city itself seemed to lean closer, listening to the quiet exchanges of its citizens, acknowledging a truth long ignored. The little brown bottles had provided relief, but they had also exacted a toll. From the trembling hands of labourers to the glassy eyes of Mayfair's elite, from the restless nights of mothers, the careful calculations of merchants, London had begun to see itself in a new light, vulnerable, dependent, and forever marked by the remedy it had trusted too readily. The fog over London had thickened to a near impenetrable grey, rolling off the Thames and into every alley, courtyard, and narrow lane as if the city itself had exhaled a dense, watchful breath. It clung to the rooftops, curling over chimneys and gas lamps, curling into every corner where shadows gathered. To those walking through it, the world felt muffled, softened, and distorted, the outlines of buildings and figures blending into one another, the familiar made strange. Yet within this haze, another kind of obscurity had settled, not a trick of the light, but a quiet, creeping dependence that threaded through every household, every parlour, every workplace. Henry Alcott, the merchant of Cheapside, stepped carefully along the slick stones, each footfall muted by the fog. He clutched his coat tighter around him, feeling the tremor in his hands that had grown subtle but persistent over months of reliance on the amber liquid. The little brown bottles had once been a solace, a measured warmth that erased fatigue and dulled aches. Now they were banned, gone from the chemist's shelves, leaving behind an absence that weighed heavier than any cold winter wind. Even as he walked, Alcott felt the pull, the quiet insistence of memory, of habit, of a comfort that no longer existed. In the East End, families huddled in small apartments, peering through fogged windows at the grey shapes passing below. Children coughed more sharply, mothers' hands shook more noticeably, and fathers leaned heavily on tables and chairs to steady themselves. The warmth that had once eased nights now existed only in recollection, a fleeting phantom in place of the tangible comfort they had known. Each household had learned, often too late, that relief comes with strings invisible to the eye, and that dependency grows quietly, often unnoticed, until the absence makes itself unbearable. In Mayfair, the fog carried the same weight, though the manifestations were subtler. The elite moved through their parlours and drawing rooms with a softer edge, their glances lingering on one another with unspoken acknowledgement. Tremors in the hands, eyes glazed with faint lethargy, and a fatigue that no tea or exercise could erase, had become marks of months of softened vigilance. The streets outside reflected this change. Carriages moved with careful deliberation, footsteps were quieter, and voices carried with a measured caution that echoed the hidden dependency within the homes they passed. Even in hospitals, the fog seemed to settle differently, pressing against windows and walls with the same quiet insistence. Patients awakened from nights of interrupted rest, Nurses moved with a heightened awareness of returning aches and tremors, and doctors, including Dr. Whitcomb, walked corridors with furrowed brows, noticing the subtle consequences of the remedy that had once promised relief. Evelyn Marsh recorded observations in her ledger, noting patterns of dependence, withdrawal, and a subtle weakening of resolve in both patients and staff. The fog, in its grey persistence, mirrored the state of the city, heavy, obscuring, and quietly oppressive. By midnight, London had grown accustomed to this new normal. The fog pressed in closer, muffling sound and light, and the citizens moved through it with tentative steps. The little brown bottles were gone, yet their legacy lingered: tremors, glassy eyes, hollowed evenings, and a city slowly learning the weight of relief once taken too freely. In every alley, every parlor, every hospital ward, the fog became both witness and accomplice, wrapping London in a quiet, enduring lesson that comfort has a cost, and absence can be more revealing than presence. The city held its breath that evening, as if aware that the nights of quiet solace were drawing to a close. Gas lamps glimmered through the dense fog, casting pale circles on cobblestones slick with moisture. In homes across London, from the narrow tenements of Whitechapel to the grand townhouses of Mayfair, residents prepared for a night that would feel markedly different, a night without the subtle warmth of the little brown bottles. The remedy that had eased coughs, dulled aches, and softened the harsh edges of existence was gone, leaving a void that every household could feel pressing upon the chest. Margaret Hollis sat in her modest room, hands folded around an empty teacup. She remembered the evenings when a small spoonful of amber liquid had soothed her cough and eased the fatigue that gnawed at her bones. Now, without it, the silence of the room felt hollow, her body tense with anticipation and the ache of absence. Each tick of the clock pressed upon her awareness of the comfort that had been taken from her, reminding her that dependency leaves a mark far deeper than relief ever could. In Mayfair, the change was no less profound, though it manifested with subtler signs. Lady Pembroke moved through her parlour with careful steps, her hands lingering over the silver tray as she poured tea. The tremor in her fingers had returned, faint but undeniable. The servants noticed, adjusting their own movements to accommodate the subtle shifts in her composure. Conversation in the room was restrained, measured, the usual air of gentle levity replaced by a quiet tension born of reliance suddenly stripped away. Even the children, who had slept longer in recent weeks under the softened nights, stirred with the first coughs of returning wakefulness. At St. Mary's Infirmary, the wards felt heavier. Patients who had depended on the amber liquid moved restlessly, murmuring for the warmth that had been a quiet constant in their lives. Nurses like Evelyn Marsh moved through the corridors with heightened alertness, noting tremors, subtle shifts in pulse, and the returning unrest in every bed. Doctors observed the patterns in silence, recording vital signs and patient behavior with meticulous attention, aware that the absence of the remedy revealed the extent of the subtle dependence that had been woven into every corner of the city. Outside, the fog swirled around the streets like a thickened shroud, muffling the sound of carriage wheels and the steps of pedestrians. London itself seemed to sense the shift, moving with a tentative rhythm, as if testing the boundaries of wakefulness without the soft haze of relief. Windows glimmered with lamplight, revealing figures lingering by their tables, hands clutching at the memory of comfort, eyes searching for warmth that would no longer come. By midnight, every household had felt the change. The little brown bottles were gone, but their influence lingered like a whisper across the city, a reminder that ease, once offered, freely carries a weight, and that the nights of comfort were fleeting. London had endured months of softened rhythms, subtle dependence, and quiet surrender. And now, as the city exhaled through fog and shuttered windows, it understood the depth of what had been lost, and the resilience required to face the nights that would never again be as gentle. London woke slowly that morning, the fog thinning to reveal the city in sharp, unforgiving light. The streets, once softened by the amber haze of the little brown bottles, now carried the full weight of reality, every cobblestone, every alleyway, every clattering cart and hurried pedestrian exposed to the stark clarity of a city that could no longer drift in quiet ease. Mothers rubbed their eyes, exhausted from restless nights, while laborers stumbled over uneven stones, muscles stiff from returning aches that had been dulled for months. The city itself seemed to inhale sharply, registering the absence of the comfort that had masked its endurance for so long. In Whitechapel, families emerged from tenements, blinking against the weak sunlight and the sharpness of returning consciousness. Children coughed violently, shaking off the lethargy that had been imposed by nightly doses of the amber liquid. Parents pressed hands to aching shoulders and stiffened backs, silently adjusting to the reality that had replaced the softened nights. Each step along the narrow streets carried the tension of alertness, a rhythm that had been dulled by dependence now suddenly reawakened. In Mayfair, the change manifested differently, but no less distinctly. Ladies, accustomed to evenings softened by the remedy, now moved through drawing rooms with a stiffness in posture and a tremor in the fingers. Gentlemen who had drifted through polite conversation with glassy eyes now held their heads a little higher, voices sharper, though the absence of the bottle made their composure fragile. Conversations, once languid and softly modulated, became abrupt, tinged with the unease of a night deprived of ease. The polished streets outside reflected this change, each carriage wheel and footstep sharper against the cobbles, as if the city itself were responding to the return of wakefulness and clarity. Even the hospitals reflected the new reality. Nurses moved briskly, attentive to patients whose coughs returned with harsh insistence, whose trembling limbs revealed the toll of months spent softened by artificial warmth. Dr. Alistair Whitcomb observed each detail with renewed scrutiny, recording the subtle variations in pulse and respiration, the flickers of awareness that had been dulled by dependence. Evelyn Marsh noted the way the wards moved in renewed rhythm, the quiet sighs and soft murmurs of patients now fully awake to their own discomfort. The city's reliance had been revealed, and the lessons could no longer be ignored. By midday, the streets had fully awoken. Carriages rattled along polished stones, vendors called their wares with renewed clarity, and pedestrians walked with deliberate steps that marked the return of the city's natural rhythm. The fog had lifted, but London carried the memory of softened nights, trembling hands, and hollowed eyes. Every household, every parlour, every tenement remembered the comfort once taken too freely, the quiet dependence that had spread unseen, and the subtle, lingering effects that would mark the city long after the bottles had vanished. London had awakened, the streets remembered, and the city, in its collective clarity, understood the weight of what it had endured, the quiet claim of relief and the lasting cost it had extracted. London's fog had lifted entirely by the early morning, leaving the city exposed and unforgiving in the pale sunlight. Streets that had once flowed with a quiet, dreamlike rhythm now echoed with the sharp clatter of boots and carts, each step a reminder of nights softened too easily by the little brown bottles. The amber remedy, gone from the shelves and hidden away from households, had left its mark on the city, subtle, enduring, and impossible to ignore. London now carried the memory of dependence in every step, every glance, every trembling hand that had relied on its ease. In Whitechapel, mothers moved briskly through narrow alleys, clutching children whose coughs had returned with harsh insistence. They recalled the nights when a spoonful of amber liquid had brought silence, warmth, and the illusion of uninterrupted rest. The streets, previously softened by the rhythm of dependence walking under the fog, now pulsed with the full awareness of the city's raw energy. Labourers stumbled over uneven stones, muscles stiff from the return of aches that had been dulled for months, and pedestrians walked with alert eyes and cautious movements, adjusting to a London that no longer offered comfort in the form of a remedy. In the wealthier districts, the change manifested with subtler, yet no less profound, consequences. Lady Pembroke's parlour, once softened by the gentle haze of the bottle, now felt tense and brittle. Her hands trembled as she poured tea, and her eyes, once glassy with relief, now carried the clarity of absence. Gentlemen, too, adjusted to the sharpness of returning awareness. Their conversations were precise, their steps deliberate, their composure carefully maintained. The streets outside reflected this change, carriages moving with calculated caution, pedestrians measured in stride. The city itself had grown aware of its new rhythm, forced into attention after months of quiet surrender to a false ease. Hospitals and infirmaries, where the amber liquid had been used to soothe both patients and staff, revealed the lingering imprint of dependence more acutely. Nurses moved briskly, noting the tremors and fatigue returning to those who had relied too heavily on the remedy. Doctors, including Dr. Whitcomb, observed the subtle residual effects: diminished stamina, glassy eyes, and faint but persistent tremors in the hands of both patients and caregivers alike. Evelyn Marsh recorded each observation with careful precision, understanding that the city's reliance had not vanished with the removal of the bottles. It remained in muscle memory, in reflex, in the quiet habits built over months of softened nights. By midday, London had fully awoken. Markets filled with noise, carriages rattled across cobblestones, and every alley and tenement carried the unmistakable energy of a city alert to its own existence. The little brown bottles were gone, yet their legacy endured. Hollowed eyes, trembling hands, softened evenings, and the collective awareness of what relief had cost. Every household, every street, every parlor remembered the comfort once taken too freely and the quiet surrender it had demanded. London had survived, but it carried the lesson of the amber remedy in every step, every sigh, every glance. The city remembered. It would never forget.